Behind the smile and attractive appearance, sometimes there are hidden corners that no one can imagine. When the truth is revealed, it is too late to save everything. On a quiet March morning in 2018, the suburban calm of Ajax, Ontario, was shattered by a crime so brutal that it left an entire community reeling. Within hours, 3 lives were extinguished, 1 family was destroyed, leaving behind painful questions about love, jealousy, and the warning signs that had gone unheeded. On March 13, 2018, Valeria Pejcinovski was eagerly anticipating the evening. School was breaking for spring vacation. The 13-year-old girl had an entire week of rest and enjoyment ahead of her. She lived with her family in Ajax, a fairly large city in the province of Ontario, Canada. Valeria and her family ones resided in a modest house that was divided into several separate apartments. She had an older sister, 16-year-old Victoria Pejcinovski, and an older brother named Roy Pejcinovski, who was 15. All 3 siblings were raised by their mother, Krasimira Pejcinovski. The children's biological father, Veselin, had divorced Krasimira a few years earlier, yet they remained on good terms. Veselin was very active in his children's lives, and they saw him regularly, often staying overnight at his place. He spent most of his time with his son Roy, while Valeria and Victoria primarily lived with their mother. Victoria, the eldest daughter, was enrolled in driving school. She practiced driving in her spare time and also worked part-time at a local beauty salon. Krasimira was employed there as well and helped both daughters get small jobs at the salon. Krasimira herself was well known and well liked, becoming close friends with the owner and many colleagues, so much so that the salon felt like a second home to her. Roy, meanwhile, was in the middle of hockey season and played for his school team. He was a talented young player. His coach firmly believed he had a bright athletic future. At that time, 39-year-old Krasimira was dating a 29-year-old man named Corey Fenn, who had 2 children from a previous relationship. Their relationship had lasted for a little more than a year, having begun when they met at a local gym in late 2016. The casual conversation soon turned into something much more. Krasimira and Corey were quickly drawn to each other and began dating. The relationship developed rapidly, and in the spring of 2017, they decided to live together. Corey moved in, began renting a basement room in Krasimira's house. From then on, Krasimira spent more and more of her time with him, often staying overnight in his room. This situation gave the children greater independence, and even though their mother was nearby, they were for the most part left unsupervised. March 13, 2018, proved to be a busy day for the entire family. That evening, Roy came home after playing in a hockey game, which was attended by both parents and his younger sister. Valeria had invited one of her closest friends, Sylvia, to stay for a sleepover, and Krasimira agreed. The day went on in an ordinary fashion. After Roy's game, Krasimira returned home and soon went downstairs to be with Corey. The 2 teenage girls entertained themselves, recording short videos, watching movies, ordering pizza, finally going to bed late that night at around 10:30 a.m. On March 14, 2018, Sylvia was awakened by the constant vibration of Valeria's mobile phone. Wanting to keep sleeping, she tried to ignore it, but after a while, she could no longer tolerate the sound. She attempted to wake her friend, but was unsuccessful. Looking at the screen, Sylvia saw numerous missed calls and messages. Thinking it might be urgent, she finally managed to rouse Valeria. It turned out that Victoria had been calling throughout the morning. Their mother was supposed to pick her up after a driving lesson, but she had not answered the phone. So she asked Valeria to go find their mother and remind her to leave. Valeria left the room, while Sylvia stayed in bed, distracted by her own phone. At 11 o'clock a woman entered the room where Sylvia was staying. She was a police officer who told Sylvia that she needed to leave the house immediately. Sylvia was instructed to move quickly and not to look around while passing through the lower rooms. Confused and frightened, she instantly realized that something terrible must have happened inside the house. Once outside, she noticed Sherry Robinson, the owner of the beauty salon where Krasimira and Vanelia worked. Over the years, Sherry and Krasimira had become best friends, and Sherry was well aware of many personal details of Krasimira's life. Seeing Sherry there only deepened Sylvia's worry. Sherry was talking with police officers and answering their questions. According to Sherry, her shop always maintains a unique atmosphere not only for customers but also for employees. This contributed positively to business, but it required all employees to follow certain standards, such as always looking polished and maintaining warm communication. For years, Krasimira excelled at this. But in the months leading up to that day, Sherry noticed a troubling change. Krasimira had grown withdrawn, spoke less, and appeared tense, an absolute transformation of character. She began taking more sick days, arrived late to work, and her once strong physical condition declined. As though she had stopped going to the gym, she looked sleep-deprived, overloaded, and constantly exhausted, perhaps even ill. Her outward appearance reflected this shift. Krasimira had lost a striking amount of weight. Instead of her usual stylish and elegant outfits, she now wore loose-fitting clothes that did not suit her. She had also stopped applying makeup, only putting on a minimal amount before work so she could look presentable for clients. At home, she no longer bothered with her appearance at all. Sherry grew worried about these changes and eventually had a heartfelt conversation with her friend. Krasimira confided that her boyfriend, Corey Fenn, often pressured her to go to parties where they drank excessively. Later, she even admitted that Corey had tried to get her addicted to banned substance. Sherry doesn't believe everything Krasimira says and thinks that the real problem isn't the parties, but their relationship itself. While the first few months of their romance resembled a typical honeymoon phase, things began to deteriorate drastically after Corey moved into Krasimira's home with his children. When Sherry first met Corey, she had mixed impressions. On one hand, he was muscular, attractive, and outwardly confident. On the other, his insecurity revealed itself in manipulative behavior. He accused Krasimira of infidelity, grew jealous of anyone she interacted with, and demanded constant updates about all her contacts. Soon, he insisted that she stop wearing makeup and dress in unflattering clothes, supposedly to deter unwanted male attention. Even though Krasimira reluctantly complied with these unreasonable demands, his jealousy persisted. Sherry realized the extent of Corey's control when Krasimira admitted she could no longer provide manicures for male clients. In his mind, the simple act of touching another person always implied something more. Their relationship seemed increasingly unstable, and Sherry recognized it clearly. One day, Sherry noticed injuries on Krasimira and soon learned that Corey had caused them. It became apparent that he was quick to anger whenever he failed to get his way. Any attempt by Krasimira to assert her boundaries provoked him, and he would lash out physically. In one confrontation, he slammed her against a wall with such force that the phone in her pocket broke. Alarmed by these revelations, Sherry tried to help her friend, repeatedly urging her to open up and insisting it was time to end the relationship. Unfortunately, Krasimira was hesitant and felt she needed more time before making such a decision. By February, Krasimira arrived at work in high spirits, happily announcing that Corey was finally moving out. The breakup had come after she discovered his infidelity. Given his constant and irrational jealousy, everyone at the salon was relieved to hear that Krasimira had ended the relationship. Still, some colleagues remained skeptical, as they had already broken up and reconciled multiple times before. And indeed, by the beginning of March, Corey had returned to the basement apartment, which had been converted into a separate living space. He promised Krasimira that he would change and that their life together would be different. Despite having regretted her forgiveness many times in the past, Krasimira once again allowed him back into her home. A week after their reconciliation, on the morning of March 14, Krasimira was scheduled to start work at 10:00 a.m. However, she never showed up. Her colleagues at the beauty salon, including Sherry Robinson, immediately became worried, especially after repeated phone calls to her went unanswered. They then tried to call Krasimira's oldest daughter, Victoria. Victoria is not at home right now. She contacted Vanelia and asked her to find their mother. Sherry developed a sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. So she decided to drive to Krasimira's house, which was about 10 minutes away from the salon. Sherry arrived at around 10:45 a.m., just minutes after Vanelia had gone downstairs to look for her mother. Despite Sherry's repeated ringing and knocking, no one answered the door. A few minutes later, Corey Fenn emerged from the basement. His unit had its own separate entrance. Corey brushed past Sherry as though nothing unusual had happened. When she asked where Krasimira was, he told her that Krasimira was sick and wouldn't be coming to work that day. Sherry was far from convinced and pressed him for more information. But Corey refused to let her inside. He insisted that Krasimira had drunk too much the night before and was merely sleeping it off. Sherry, sensing something was terribly wrong, refused to accept his explanation. During the exchange, she noticed Corey's suspicious demeanor. He was shirtless, breathing heavily, and drenched in sweat. On closer inspection, Sherry saw several dark red stains on his body that looked very much like blood. Still, Corey continued to insist that Krasimira was fine and did not allow Sherry into the basement. Eventually, Sherry pretended to accept his explanation, saying she would head back to the salon. Corey seemed to relax and even promised that Krasimira would call as soon as she felt better. Sherry got into her car and pretended to leave, but after driving only about 100 meters, she stopped and called 911. She explained her concerns to the dispatcher and requested a welfare check. While she was still on the phone, watching in her rearview mirror, she saw Corey walk out of the house, get into his pickup truck, and drive away. Summoning her courage, Sherry returned to the house. To her surprise, the front door was ajar. She stepped inside and called out for Krasimira, but received no reply. Though she wanted to check the rooms, a strong sense of dread convinced her to retreat outside and wait for the police. Her instincts proved tragically correct. Within minutes, officers arrived and began searching Corey's basement apartment. Inside, they witnessed a horrifying scene. The first discovery was the body of Krasimira's 15-year-old son, Roy, lying on the floor, wedged between the headboard and the wall. The room was in disarray, with bedding and clothing strewn about, some of it tied together into a large bundle, with a blanket. The second discovery was 13-year-old Vanelia, who had also been brutally attacked. Unlike her brother, she had not been strangled, but she had suffered multiple stab wounds. Miraculously, she was still alive and was rushed to a nearby hospital. Krasimira herself was nowhere to be found in the basement, so the search continued. It was not until around 2:00 p.m. that her body was finally located. She had been hidden in the garage, naked and concealed beneath a pile of old tires, garbage, and cardboard boxes. The injuries showed that she had been brutally beaten, stabbed multiple times, and had obvious strangulation marks on her neck. The sheer brutality of the attack was later confirmed during the coroner's examination. Krasimira alone had sustained 17 broken bones. In addition to the many stab wounds, she had multiple broken ribs, fractures to her facial bones, shattered upper and lower jaws. The other victims showed similarly extensive trauma. The knife used to kill Krasimira was found near her body in the garage, while another kitchen knife had been used to stab Vanelia. The violence was so extreme that the victims were left almost unrecognizable. Most of the injuries were concentrated on the head, neck, and chest. All three victims bore defensive wounds, but tragically, none had the strength to withstand Corey's assault. From the very beginning, Corey Fenn was the detective's primary suspect. The police quickly gathered statements from Victoria, Sylvia, and Sherry. Their accounts left little room for doubt about Corey's involvement in the attack. The problem, however, is that Corey has run away, giving him a dangerous head start. After fleeing in his pickup truck, Corey drove northwest into a neighboring town where he abandoned the vehicle. From there, he walked to a nearby gas station, called for a taxi, and continued on his way. He left his cell phone inside the truck to mislead investigators. Yet he made a critical error by going directly to the home of his ex-wife and children. Naturally, the police identified that location as one of the first places to search, and their instincts proved correct. Corey was discovered hiding in the attic. When officers attempted to arrest Corey, he resisted fiercely, lashing out at several policemen. A stun gun was used to subdue him, and due to injuries sustained in the struggle, he was taken to a hospital before being transferred to the police station. Inside the attic, investigators found a gym bag that Corey had been carrying. The bag contained a significant quantity of illegal banned substance, scales, packaging materials, and roughly $4,000 in cash. This evidence strongly indicated that Corey was not only a user, but also actively involved in distribution. Additional personal items, including vodka, bodybuilding supplements, and anabolic steroids, were also recovered. Meanwhile, 13-year-old Vanelia Pejcinovski was fighting desperately for her life at the hospital. Doctors worked tirelessly for hours to stabilize her, but the damage was too severe. That evening, she succumbed to her injuries. Her older sister, Victoria, who had rushed to the hospital upon learning of the attack, stayed by her side until the very end. Vanelia died in her sister's arms. During interrogation, Corey almost immediately confessed to killing 3 people, fleeing the scene, attempting to conceal evidence, and resisting arrest. However, he sought to lessen his responsibility by claiming the murders were the product of banned, substance-induced psychosis. According to his version, in the days before the killings, he had been using banned substance heavily and slipped into a deranged, uncontrollable state. He insisted he was plagued by paranoid delusions and auditory hallucinations, which supposedly drove him to attack Krasimira and her children. Yet, as questioning continued, glaring inconsistencies emerged in Corey's account. His claims of psychosis appeared to be nothing more than a fabricated excuse to mask uncontrolled rage and jealousy. At times, he pretended to have no memory of key details. At other times, he recounted events with remarkable precision. When pressed about these contradictions, Corey stated that he simply did not want to relive the events in his mind because he would be haunted by the trauma for the rest of his life. Despite having brutally murdered 3 people, he attempted to paint himself as the victim. Later, his story shifted again. Corey now attempted to cast blame on Krasimira herself. He alleged that when she drank alcohol, she became paranoid and suspicious, accusing him of cheating and even searching the apartment for other women. He claimed that this was exactly what had occurred in the early morning hours of March 14. With Krasimira screaming and behaving irrationally, that this supposedly provoked his attack. Investigators carefully examined Corey's narrative and considered whether banned substance use and alcohol might have influenced his behavior, but this theory quickly collapsed. Toxicology reports showed that Krasimira and Corey did not use any of those substances. Contrary to his testimony, his claim that she provoked him through drunkenness was therefore baseless. Moreover, no explanation could justify the sheer level of violence inflicted in the triple homicide. The psychosis defense grew even weaker after police interviewed others who had interacted with Corey on March 14, including his ex-girlfriend. They all described him as calm, coherent, and showing no outward signs of drug intoxication. Corey's actions appeared deliberate and methodical. This was clear from his efforts to clean the apartment after the murders and from the way he tried to chase Sherry away from the house. Corey Fenn even deleted all the data from his cell phone and abandoned his pickup truck with the phone still inside, deliberately attempting to mislead investigators. His rational mindset was also evident when he specifically asked about Victoria through Sylvia. He showed no concern for Krasimira's friend. His focus was solely on members of the Pejcinovski family. This selectivity strongly suggested that he was not impaired by banned substance or alcohol and that he was fully aware of his actions. Detectives concluded that the crime bore all the hallmarks of planning and premeditation. When investigators interviewed Victoria, the surviving daughter, she provided critical insight into Corey's behavior. She explained that on March 13, she had not initially intended to spend the night at her father's house. While searching for something at home earlier that day, she had stumbled upon a large bag filled with illegal banned substance. Disturbed, she confronted her mother, warning that if Corey continued to keep such substances in the house, she would report it to the police. Outraged by the discovery, Krasimira assured her daughter that she was ending the relationship for good. She planned to order Corey out of the basement apartment and never let him return. Still shaken by what had happened, Victoria chose to stay at her father's place that evening, not wanting to be present for another inevitable confrontation. Detectives came to believe that the outbreak of violence most likely occurred after Krasimira confronted Corey. She may have mentioned both the discovery of the banned substance and the threat of going to the authorities, which escalated the situation. It became clear why Corey had later been searching for Victoria inside the house. He saw her as the person most likely to expose his criminal activities. Silencing her would have protected him, and the only reason she survived was because she happened to be elsewhere that night. According to the reconstruction of events, the triple homicide did not unfold all at once, but stretched over nearly 5 hours. After killing Krasimira and hiding her body in the garage, Corey attempted to tidy up the basement before going in search of Victoria. Instead, he encountered Roy. Corey strangled Roy into unconsciousness and then beat him to death. Hours later, Venelia, who had been upstairs with her friend Sylvia, came downstairs looking for her mother, a fatal mistake that sealed her fate. With Victoria's testimony in hand, police were confident they had a solid case for premeditation. Corey Fenn was charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder. The trial itself proved long and complicated, partly because of the global issue and partly due to Corey's own actions. He dismissed his lawyer, then declared he would represent himself. The court assigned standby counsel, but Corey continually obstructed the lawyer's efforts. The attorney believed Corey should plead guilty to the triple murder while emphasizing mitigating factors such as substance abuse. Corey, however, insisted this was a mistake and clung to the argument that banned, substance-induced psychosis absolved him of responsibility. During the proceedings, not a single witness was called for the defense. Corey's self-representation amounted to little more than a repetitive recital of the same excuses. The situation grew even more surreal when he announced in court that he now had God inside him. He claimed that after completing a rehabilitation program at the Toronto South Detention Centre, he had rethought his actions and reformed. To observers, this came across as delusion rather than a genuine legal defense. It appeared Corey was attempting to convince the court of his insanity, but his strategy failed completely. In February 2022, Corey Fenn, 33, was found guilty of murdering Krasimira, Roy, and Vanelia Pejcinovski. His sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. By then, his courtroom behavior had grown even more erratic. He continued to insist that the God within him had cleansed him, and he even announced plans to file a civil lawsuit against the state for alleged mistreatment. His repeated interruptions eventually led to his removal from the courtroom, after which he was forced to watch the proceedings remotely. In Canada, a conviction for second-degree murder carries a mandatory life sentence, with the possibility of parole after at least 10 years. These parole ineligibility periods can be ordered to run either concurrently or consecutively. In this case, the Crown argued for consecutive sentences, which would effectively ensure that Corey Fenn would spend the rest of his life behind bars. However, just prior to his trial, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that consecutive parole ineligibility periods constitute cruel and unconstitutional punishment. Even so, considering the extreme brutality of the crimes and Corey's utter lack of remorse, it was clear that he would almost certainly never walk free again. Ultimately, Corey Fenn was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years for the murder of Krasimira Pejcinovski, Vanelia Pejcinovski, and Roy Pejcinovski. The murders devastated everyone connected to the Pejcinovski family. Krasimira's father recounted that he was bedridden for days, lost in grief, constantly reliving nightmares of what had happened. Vanelia's close friend also struggled deeply, tormented by memories of that morning. Sherry Robinson, who had bravely insisted on checking the house, admitted that she often questioned whether she could have done more to save them. But the heaviest burden fell on Victoria, Krasimira's surviving daughter. She carries a profound sense of guilt, convinced that if she had been home that night, she might have been able to protect her mother and siblings. Yet those around her believe otherwise, that had she been present, she too would have become one of Corey Fenn's victims. June 22, 1980 was a Sunday. Early that morning, 25 years old, Stephanie Malin returned home at around 4 a.m. after finishing her shift as a waitress at a restaurant. Before going home, she stopped by a colleague's house, so by the time she got back, she was very exhausted. Everyone in the house was asleep. As she walked through the first floor, Stephanie noticed her 14-year-old cousin, Suzanne Bombardier, wasn't there. Suzanne usually waited on the living room sofa to greet her, but she assumed the girl must be elsewhere in the house. Despite calling Suzanne's name several times, she got no response. While the situation seemed odd, Stephanie wasn't alarmed. It was too early to search the house thoroughly, and she didn't want to wake her daughters, aged 5 and 6, who were sleeping in their room the night before. June 21st, Stephanie had asked Suzanne to babysit her girls. Suzanne loved spending time with the children and was excited to help. Known for being a responsible and kind teenager with excellent grades and big dreams for the future, Suzanne had eagerly accepted the task. Stephanie assumed Suzanne had fallen asleep in the children's room after putting them to bed. Feeling tired herself, Stephanie also went to bed without checking further. A few hours later, she woke up and began preparing breakfast for the kids. While she was in the kitchen, the phone rang. It was Suzanne's mother asking when her daughter would be coming home. Wanting to ask Suzanne directly, Stephanie went to the children's room, but found that the little girl wasn't there. Her daughters said Suzanne hadn't been in their room when they woke up and didn't know where she was. Growing concerned, Stephanie searched the entire house, from the first floor to the second, but Suzanne was nowhere to be found. It became clear that Suzanne hadn't spent the night at the house. Stephanie was alarmed. Stephanie called her own mother to inform her of Suzanne's disappearance. Both were confused, as Suzanne had always been a responsible teen. She never ran away, had no boyfriend, and certainly wouldn't leave young children alone in the house. Stephanie carefully searched for any clues about Suzanne's whereabouts, but found nothing. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, she and her mother contacted the police. Law enforcement officers arrived and began investigating. They asked when Suzanne was last seen. Stephanie recounted that on the evening of June 21st, she was preparing for her restaurant shift and asked Suzanne to watch the kids. After work, Stephanie planned to stop by a co-worker's birthday party. At around 8 p.m., Stephanie called home and asked Suzanne to bring her some clean clothes to work. Suzanne agreed and brought them. That was the last time Stephanie saw Suzanne. After delivering the clothes, Suzanne headed back home. Stephanie watched her cross the street and waved goodbye. This account was corroborated by Stephanie's daughters and her co-workers. The children confirmed that Suzanne returned home, gave them dinner, and helped tidy up their toys. They also remembered what Suzanne was wearing: a nightgown and a red robe. Suzanne wasn't dressed to go out, which suggested she wasn't planning to leave the house. After putting the children to bed, Suzanne intended to watch TV or read a pastime she enjoyed. She was supposed to spend the night at Stephanie's house and head home the next morning after breakfast. At around 1:30 SME, while at her co-worker's birthday party, Stephanie called home again to check in. Suzanne answered promptly and reassured her that everything was fine. The children were safely asleep, and Suzanne, feeling tired, was getting ready for bed. This phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Suzanne. Using eyewitness accounts, investigators pieced together a rough timeline of the incident. Suzanne disappeared within a 2-hour window between 1:30 a.m., when Stephanie last called home, and 4 a.m., when Stephanie returned home and realized Suzanne was missing. The police initially suggested she might have run away, but her mother and sister rejected this possibility. Suzanne was calm, mild-mannered, and had no history of conflict with her family or aggressive behavior. Her teenage years were uneventful, and there was no reason to believe she would have left voluntarily. Moreover, her belongings, including her bag, clothes, and shoes, were left behind. It was highly unlikely that she would have run away wearing just a robe and slippers. The possibility of a kidnapping was considered. Detectives theorized that burglars might have broken in and encountered Suzanne, either as an unintended witness or because she attempted to intervene. However, this seemed improbable. No valuables or belongings were missing from the home, according to Stephanie, and there were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Given the lack of disturbance, detectives speculated that Suzanne may have voluntarily allowed someone she knew into the house or left with them willingly. The lack of any evidence of a struggle or violence in the home. Everything was undisturbed, added to the mystery. The children sleeping in adjacent rooms heard nothing unusual. Investigators also questioned nearby neighbors in the townhouse complex. Families in neighboring units, who might have overheard something through the walls, reported nothing suspicious. Suzanne's disappearance shocked the quiet neighborhood and became the focal point of concern throughout the district. From the start, the case appeared inexplicable, and detectives struggled to find solid leads. Authorities combed the area around the house and thoroughly searched the premises, but found no new evidence. Neighbors and Suzanne's school community were interviewed, but no one had valuable information. Residents hadn't seen any unusual people or vehicles in the area. That Sunday evening had been an ordinary night, and given the time period, CCTV cameras were not yet common. The lack of surveillance made it harder for detectives to progress, and the investigation hit a dead end. Desperate for leads, police appealed to the public for any information. They received tips from several witnesses, but none panned out. 5 days after Suzanne's disappearance, there were still no breakthroughs or new evidence. Detectives began to suspect the worst, that Suzanne may have been killed, though her family refused to accept this possibility and clung to hope that she would be found alive. In the meantime, Suzanne's family worked tirelessly to spread awareness of her disappearance. They plastered the streets with flyers and distributed them widely. Investigators examined the family's immediate environment, but found no one who posed a potential threat to Suzanne. Her social circle didn't include any troublemaking teens. Detectives also started reviewing the profiles of local criminals with histories of abuse or violent offenses, but each had a verified alibi. The case took a tragic turn on June 27th, about 100 kilometers from where Suzanne lived. A man fishing on the San Joaquin River spotted something unusual in the water. Upon closer inspection from his boat, he discovered the naked body of a girl, washed up by the riverbank near a bridge. The man immediately alerted the police. The body was retrieved and sent for forensic analysis. Although it had been in the water for several days and had begun to decompose, the decomposition was not severe enough to erase all evidence related to the case. The forensic expert determined that the girl had been abused, and her death was caused by a stab wound to the chest. The victim had no identification or personal belongings that could help identify her. Authorities began checking local missing person reports and found one from the Bombardier family that stood out. Due to the warm season and the body's exposure to water, the body had swollen, making identification difficult. Ultimately, dental records confirmed the victim was Suzanne Bombardier. The forensic team collected evidence related to the crime and made attempts to study the perpetrator, but the technology of the 1980s was limited. At the time, there was no database to compare information, so law enforcement could only file the collected evidence and continue the search. Suzanne's disappearance was later classified as a murder investigation, with two main suspects identified: a man with a history of violence who lived near Stephanie's home, and Stephanie's ex-boyfriend, who had been behaving erratically. Before Suzanne disappeared, he had begged Stephanie for a second chance, but left shortly after being rejected. There were no other suspicious individuals within Suzanne's circle who might have had access to her. Detectives carefully investigated both suspects, but found no solid evidence, no witnesses, fingerprints, or anything to directly link them to the crime. Eventually, the leads were dropped, and efforts to find the killer failed. The case materials were archived, leaving Suzanne's murder unsolved for years. 14-year-old Suzanne Bombardier was buried in Lafayette, leaving her family devastated. The tragedy deeply affected her mother, who fainted upon learning her daughter's body had been found. The blow was made even crueler when, shortly after the terrible news, Suzanne's school report card arrived, showing only excellent grades. The community was shaken and outraged by the failure to find her killer. Concerned citizens often called the police station with leads, but none of them proved to be useful. Over the years, investigators tried several times to analyze the criminal's DNA found on Suzanne's body. In the 1990s, despite progress in building DNA databases, poor sample quality and limited technology hampered the process. By the 2000s, the case had faded from public memory, remembered only by Suzanne's family and community elders determined to see justice served. In 2014, local journalist Jennifer Kathleen Gibbons learned about the case and was shocked that the killer had never been caught and might still be free. She located Suzanne's grave and started blogging about the crime, speaking in depth with Suzanne's family, residents, and retired detectives. Her regular posts reignited public interest in the case, sparking questions about why the killer remained unpunished. Although the police have not given up on the case, Jennifer's posts have increased public pressure, prompting the police to step up their investigation to find answers. In 2015, a newly formed cold case task force revisited Suzanne Bombardier's murder. Several police officers requested the sheriff's approval and resources to address this tragic unsolved case. DNA samples from Suzanne's case were retrieved from the archives, and the team, consisting of dedicated law enforcement professionals, began the challenging work of reviewing the decades-old evidence. Suzanne's case was the oldest unsolved violent crime in Antioch. The timing of the investigation was deliberate, as advancements in forensic technology could now analyze degraded or limited DNA samples, tools that hadn't been available during the original investigation. With renewed hope and determination, investigators sought to finally bring Suzanne's killer to justice. Nearly 40-year-old evidence was sent to the San Mateo County Medical Examiner's Lab, enabling investigators, for the first time, to create a complete DNA profile of the killer. Previous efforts had failed, due to inadequate technology, but this time was different. In early 2017, armed with the DNA profile, investigators compared it to a database of registered criminals. To their surprise, the results pointed to Mitchell Lynn Bacon, a major breakthrough in the case. Initially skeptical, detectives conducted additional tests, cross-checking the profile with the FBI DNA database. The results confirmed a match. Mitchell Lynn Bacon, born on March 21, 1954, in a small town near Racine, California. He had lived in Antioch, where he crossed paths with Stephanie and Suzanne. He had long been a suspect in Suzanne's murder, but a lack of evidence had prevented charges until now. In 1973, Mitchell had been convicted of multiple crimes, including assault, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Though the charges could have warranted life imprisonment, leniency was granted due to his lack of a prior record. After serving his sentence, he was arrested again in 1981 for more violent crimes and received a 24-year prison sentence. His offenses primarily involved abuse. Upon his release, he was required to register as an abuser offender but failed to do so. This violation led to another 4-year prison sentence in 2002, officially entering him into criminal databases. When police tracked down 63-year-old Mitchell in 2017, he was still living in Antioch. He was arrested calmly as he returned from the store. Despite overwhelming evidence, he denied any involvement in Suzanne's murder. After his arrest, detectives held a press conference, announcing plans to compare his DNA to other unsolved cases. By the time of his capture, he had lived unpunished for 37 years. His methods resembled those of a serial killer, prompting suspicions that he might be linked to additional murders. For Suzanne's family, justice finally seemed within reach. One of the key obstacles to convicting Mitchell in 1980 had been his alibi. He claimed he had been with his aunt at a bar in a nearby town, far from Suzanne's babysitting location. According to him, he left the bar around 2 a.m., stopped at an intersection, visited a convenience store where the clerk recognized him, and then drove home. His aunt and the store clerk both corroborated his story, creating a plausible, albeit tight, timeline that cast doubt on his involvement. This alibi prevented investigators from conclusively linking him to the crime, even though he was considered the most likely suspect. Stephanie, however, had long believed Mitchell was involved in her cousin Suzanne's murder. As someone who had interacted with the family during their brief relationship, Mitchell had earned Suzanne's trust, a trust that tragically sealed her fate. On the night of the murder, she unknowingly let him in, unaware of the danger he posed. Stephanie had ended her relationship with Mitchell after just 3 dates, finding him unsettling. After their breakup, Mitchell began regularly visiting the restaurant where she worked, sitting at a nearby table and silently watching her without ordering anything. His alarming behavior foreshadowed the darker truth that would come to light decades later. Stephanie felt intimidated by Mitchell's behavior and chose to cut off all contact with him. However, he refused to leave her alone. He left notes on her doorstep and repeatedly showed up at her workplace, attempting to reconnect. Stephanie later learned that one of her colleagues had given him her home address. The colleague claimed ignorance of their breakup, but this act put Suzanne in danger and ultimately led to her kidnapping, abuse, and murder. In 1980, during the investigation, Mitchell was offered a polygraph test, which he agreed to take. However, the results were inconclusive. Despite multiple interrogations, Mitchell never confessed, and due to insufficient evidence, he couldn't be definitively linked to the crime. Finally, 37 years later, he was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and abuse. A forensic expert couldn't determine whether Suzanne had been abused before or after her murder. The prosecutor debated whether to pursue life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. Mitchell continued to deny his involvement in the murder. Ultimately, the prosecution opted for life imprisonment, as seeking the death penalty could result in prolonged legal battles and appeals. In such cases, defense lawyers often file repeated appeals, forcing the victim's family to continually relive the tragedy. Additionally, given Mitchell's age, it was uncertain whether he would live long enough to face execution. Once the decision for a life sentence was made, an official reconstruction of events followed. The prosecution argued that Mitchell coerced Suzanne into leaving her house since she would never have abandoned her young nieces under any circumstances. It was believed that Mitchell threatened Suzanne with a knife, forcing her to leave her home. Her family believed she sacrificed herself to protect her nieces from harm. According to the prosecution, Suzanne was killed with a knife that had a blade at least 15 centimeters long. The blade was sharp enough to pierce her heart with a single fatal strike, causing near-instant death. The prosecution also contended that Mitchell used the same knife to threaten her during the abduction. After committing the crime, he disposed of Suzanne's body. It is believed that Mitchell took Suzanne to a remote location, where he abused her and then killed her with immense force, nearly piercing her body completely. The prosecution argued that Mitchell abused her again after her death. The defense took an unusual approach. They argued, citing a state law that imposes a lighter sentence for abuse of a corpse, that the abuse occurred after Suzanne was dead, and that Mitchell was not involved in her kidnapping or murder. Instead, they claimed he found Suzanne's lifeless body and took advantage of the situation. This argument was strengthened by the lack of evidence proving Suzanne's abduction. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle at Stephanie's home, giving the defense room to create doubt. However, the prosecution still had critical evidence to counter these claims. Mitchell's criminal history followed a clear and troubling pattern across several recorded incidents. In 1973, he was arrested after being suspected of abuse an underage girl during a burglary. During the investigation, it was revealed that he was guilty of another crime, which led to charges of abuse, burglary, and assault with intent to kill. Following his release, he broke into another home in a different city, where he committed robbery and abused a schoolgirl. During the assault, he tied up the victim, burned her with a cigarette, and stabbed her with a knife. Miraculously, the girl survived. The victim recalled Mitchell's unsettling behavior during the attack. He appeared to enjoy his actions immensely, humming and laughing to himself like a deranged individual. The physical and emotional scars left on the survivor required a long recovery. Prosecutors argued that the similarities between these crimes provided significant evidence linking him to the kidnapping and murder of Suzanne Bombardier. The trial for Suzanne's case was set for March 2022. After Mitchell's arrest, a press conference highlighted the persistent efforts of the detectives who had volunteered to investigate Antioche's oldest case. The police also credited the media's role in keeping Suzanne's story alive through reports published in 2015 and 2016. Authorities stressed the possibility of Mitchell being involved in other violent crimes around the U.S. In their appeal to the public, they urged anyone with information about his involvement in other crimes to contact the Antioche Police Department. They reassured people that Mitchell was now in custody and posed no threat, encouraging past victims or witnesses to come forward. However, no one responded to their call for information. The trial concluded on March 15, 2022, when the jury unanimously convicted Mitchell Lynn Bacon of first-degree murder, as well as other charges such as robbery, kidnapping, and abuse. On June 27, 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During his sentencing hearing, a chilling revelation emerged. A former prisoner claims Mitchell confessed to systematically abusing and killing escort girls while working as a truck driver, traveling across the country for years. Authorities are currently investigating these claims to uncover evidence of these alleged crimes. However, Mitchell has denied these accusations, calling his former cellmate's story a fabrication. The search for truth continues as authorities work to determine whether Mitchell is responsible for more atrocities. Diaz met Jared James Deacus while working at Cheppy's Meat Market, a local grocery store in Taqueria, Texas. At the time, Angi was a 21-year-old immigrant from Nicaragua who had come to the U.S. seeking a better life for herself and her family. Jared, also 21, had recently started working at the same store. The two quickly grew close. Angi is impressed with Jared's friendly personality and hard-working spirit, which harmonizes well with her responsibility and maturity, as she is the eldest of 4 siblings. During their work breaks, they would talk and laugh about their dreams and future plans. To her, Jared is a reliable support and brings her comfort, having left Nicaragua and her family behind, particularly her mother, who was battling cancer. Angi longed for someone to share her struggles and aspirations with. Her devotion to her family and determination to provide for them drove her to work multiple jobs, and Jared's companionship filled her with hope. Their friendship at work soon blossomed into a romantic relationship. Outside of work, they grew closer by sharing meals and discussing their goals. To those around them, Angi and Jared seemed like a happy and loving young couple, trying to build a future together in America. She had recently achieved a significant personal goal, becoming a fitness coach, a testament to her dedication and perseverance. Angi's co-workers at Chepi's meat market often remarked on her joy when she was with Jared. Her boss, Veronica Jimenez, noted how she would brighten up when talking about him and described her as being incredibly happy in her relationship. However, as their relationship became more serious, small changes in Angi's behavior began to indicate that not everything was going smoothly. While these shifts were initially dismissed as normal life stresses, they began to raise concerns among her loved ones. Jared proposed to Angi after months of dating, and she was thrilled to accept. Marriage symbolized not just love, but also stability and partnership, which Angi hoped would help her continue supporting her family in Nicaragua. Their engagement was full of excitement as they planned for their future. On October 22, 2022, they tied the knot in a wedding ceremony officiated by Waller County Judge Trey Duhon, who later described them as a kind and loving young couple. Friends and family came together to celebrate what seemed to be the start of a happy, secure future for the pair. After their wedding, Angi and Jared decided to move into a small cabin on Jared's parents' property on Oak Hollow Boulevard in Waller County, Texas. This provided affordable housing as they worked on building their financial foundation as a couple. For Angi, who regularly sent money back to Nicaragua, the arrangement was practical. She balanced her job at Chepi's meat market with her fitness coaching career, earning consistent praise from her manager, Ruth Armendariz, for her dedication and positive attitude. Co-workers described her as hardworking, energetic, and highly ambitious. However, cracks began to show in their seemingly happy relationship. While Angi kept up her cheerful persona, her boss, Veronica Jimenez, noticed subtle changes. Veronica recalled that some days Angi seemed different, explaining that she appeared tired, though it wasn't clear whether it was because of work or her relationship. Jared's arrest for driving under the influence just a month into their marriage was the first major warning sign. The incident occurred at a Whataburger restaurant, where employees called the police after Jared became aggressive and tried to force his way inside. Responding officers described him as belligerent and locked him out of the building. During a search of his car, police found a partially full bottle of Bud Light. Jared admitted to taking pills but couldn't specify the medication. Beyond the legal consequences, this event revealed aspects of Jared's behavior Angi likely had not fully understood before their marriage. The situation worsened during Jared's booking process, where his aggressive behavior escalated. Court records showed Jared threatened both the arresting officers and jail staff. His actions became so disruptive that he punched windows and had to be restrained in a chair for safety. This incident highlighted a troubling pattern of aggression that would later become even more significant. As time passed, friends and family noticed more worrying signs in Angi and Jared's marriage. While Angi had seemed very happy at first, her demeanor changed after the wedding. At social gatherings, friends saw a difference in her, though she never openly complained or sought help. One notable incident occurred at a Christmas party in December 2022, just weeks before Angi's death. Friends said that she and Jared left the party abruptly, and Jared looked very upset. Although this worried everyone, no one realized the true severity of the problem. During this period, law enforcement had been called to their home multiple times for domestic disturbances. While Waller County Sheriff Troy Guidry noted that these calls didn't involve extreme violence, they reflected ongoing conflict within the marriage. An unnamed friend of Angi later revealed that Jared had displayed possessive behavior during their marriage. He was described as jealous, and one particular social media post stood out where Jared had written that she was his. The friend found it unsettling, commenting that no one had questioned their relationship, making the post seem unnecessary. Such possessiveness is often a warning sign of potential domestic violence. Despite the warning signs, Angi seemed determined to stay in her marriage. Her friends later speculated that she might have been too embarrassed to admit her relationship was struggling. This hesitation to seek help or openly talk about relationship issues is sadly common among domestic violence victims, who often feel ashamed or believe they can manage the situation on their own. What made Angi's story especially tragic was her unwavering devotion to her family in Nicaragua. Despite facing difficulties in her marriage, she worked 2 jobs to help fund her mother's cancer treatment, showcasing her selflessness and dedication. Her co-workers at Cheppy's Meat Market and Taqueria described her as someone who always put others first and aimed to improve not just her own life, but her entire family's well-being. By January 2023, tensions in Angi and Jared's marriage were clearly escalating. While the specifics of their private arguments remain unknown, it was evident that underlying issues were coming to a dangerous head. Angi, who had immigrated to the U.S. with hope and determination, found herself trapped in a marriage that had become increasingly volatile and unsafe. On the morning of January 11th, 2023, surveillance footage captured Jared at Angi's workplace around 11:40 a.m. The video showed him entering the store, grabbing a beer, and leaving without paying. Even more alarming, he was seen drinking the beer in his car before driving away. This illegal act and erratic behavior suggested Jared was in a highly unstable mental state, possibly reflecting or preparing for what was to come. The footage provided critical insight, revealing a man acting irrationally just hours before an unthinkable crime. Jared's casual theft, his reckless drinking behind the wheel, and his escalating instability painted a picture of someone whose judgment was severely impaired. These actions foreshadowed a tragedy that would devastate 2 families and shock the Waller County community. Later that day, at approximately 4:35 p.m., Jared's parents made a 911 call that would change lives forever. They reported a possible death at their property, specifically inside the small cabin where Jared and Angi lived. Sheriff Troy Guidry later said Jared's father contacted authorities shortly after Jared entered the main house and made a disturbing comment, causing them to worry about Angi's safety. When Waller County deputies arrived, they encountered what Sheriff Troy described as a horrific scene. Inside the cabin, they found Angi's lifeless body near the bed, amidst evidence of extreme violence. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to her back, and the brutality of the attack was shocking. Blood was splattered throughout the cabin, and investigators discovered her body on the floor near the bed in a pool of blood. Disturbingly, her severed head was found in the shower. The severity of the violence left even seasoned law enforcement officers horrified. Crime scene investigators determined that a kitchen knife was used in the attack. Sheriff Troy confirmed that everything occurred on the property, and all evidence was recovered and submitted. The events of that day marked one of the most horrendous crimes in Waller County's history, leaving an indelible mark on the community and on everyone who knew Angi. The brutal and calculated nature of the violence, along with the disposal of Angi's body, shocked investigators. When deputies arrived at the crime scene, they found Jared still present on the property. Rather than fleeing or hiding his actions, he stayed at the location where he had committed the horrific crime. Jared and his parents were taken in for questioning, but it quickly became evident that Jared was solely responsible for the violent act. During his initial interview, Jared gave what Sheriff Troy described as a complete and straightforward confession, admitting to murdering his wife, Angi. While he described what he had done, he offered no explanation or motive for the senseless brutality. Jared confessed to killing Angi in their shared home. However, the lack of a clear motive left investigators and the community stunned. It was incomprehensible that a 21-year-old man could commit such a heinous act against his wife, whom he had married just 3 months earlier. The randomness and cruelty of the crime contradicted everything people believed about Jared and his relationship with Angi. The investigation revealed further disturbing details about the incident of January 11, 2023. Evidence indicated that Angi had fought desperately for her life. Multiple stab wounds to her back suggested that she had tried to flee or defend herself during the attack. Adding to the heartbreak was the discovery that Angi had reportedly been living in fear in the weeks leading up to her death. Prior calls to law enforcement hinted at rising tensions within the home, though no one had anticipated such a horrifying conclusion. For Angi's family in Nicaragua, the loss was beyond devastating. She had left her home country to create a better life and support her family's medical expenses, but her dreams ended in an unimaginable tragedy. Her mother, already battling cancer, now faced the overwhelming grief of losing her eldest daughter. The crime scene investigation lasted several days as law enforcement meticulously gathered evidence to piece together what had happened in the cabin that afternoon. Although the physical evidence detailed the brutal tragedy, the deeper psychological and emotional factors behind Jared's actions remained unclear. When Jared was charged with murder and booked into the Waller County Jail, the community began to confront the reality of how domestic violence could escalate to such a serious level. Although there had been prior warnings, including domestic disturbance reports and concerning behavior from Jared, no one foresaw the violence that ultimately unfolded. The investigation also shed light on Angi's life and the dreams that were tragically cut short. Friends and colleagues shared memories of her ambition, dedication to her family, and pride in her work as a fitness coach. Her untimely death felt even more tragic, as it robbed her of a bright future and a positive impact she had been making on those around her. As the trial progresses, many questions remain about Jared's motive for committing this horrific crime. Although further details about Jared's mental state and behavior emerged during the investigation, the fundamental question of why this tragedy occurred remained only partially answered. With Jared in custody and having confessed to the crime, attention turned to the legal process that would decide his fate. However, no outcome could restore the life lost or ease the grief of Angi's loved ones, who had envisioned a brighter future for her in America. The case immediately raised important questions about domestic violence, mental health, and the systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals. Just months before the crime, Jared had been arrested for DWI and exhibited violent behavior during that incident, yet no system intervened to prevent him from continuing to pose a threat to Angi. Following his arrest and confession, investigators closely examined Jared's background and mental health to understand what led to the tragedy. During the pre-trial phase, Jared's mental health and competency to stand trial became significant concerns. The Waller County Criminal District Attorney's Office acknowledged questions about his mental state. This prompted a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation to determine if Jared could comprehend the charges and participate in his defense. After a thorough assessment, the psychiatrist concluded that, despite any mental health issues, Jared was competent to stand trial. This determination allowed the legal process to proceed, holding Jared fully accountable for his actions. Initially, he was held on a $500,000 bond, but Waller County Criminal District Attorney Sean G. Whitmore argued that this amount was inadequate given the severity of the crime, citing the brutal nature of Angi's murder and Jared's history of violent behavior, Sean petitioned for the bond to be increased to $1 million. The district attorney's request was supported by Jared's past actions, including his threats against police officers and jail staff during his arrest 2 months prior. These incidents highlighted Jared's violent tendencies, especially under stress or the influence of substances, and emphasized the public safety risk he posed. After hearing both sides, the judge approved raising the bond to $1 million and ordered an additional mental health evaluation to further assess Jared's psychological state before trial. As legal proceedings moved forward, District Attorney Whitmore worked closely with Angi's family to understand their feelings and priorities. While grieving and organizing the repatriation of Angi's remains to Nicaragua, the family expressed a desire for justice without enduring a prolonged and painful trial. Prosecutors and defense attorneys began discussions on a plea agreement that could resolve the case without a trial. This agreement aimed to secure a significant prison sentence for Jared while sparing Angi's family the trauma of revisiting the tragic details in court. The negotiations were challenging, requiring a balance between the severity of the crime, the legal process, and the family's wishes. Prosecutors sought a resolution that acknowledged the heinous nature of the crime while offering closure to those grieving Angi. Meanwhile, the community grappled with the broader implications of the tragedy. Domestic violence advocates used the case to raise awareness about recognizing warning signs and supporting individuals in potentially dangerous relationships. The multiple visits by law enforcement to Jared and Angi's home before the murders were a clear warning that domestic violence can escalate over time and often leads to serious consequences. On July 31, 2024, more than a year after Angi's death, Jared James Deacus appeared in court before Judge Gary Chaney to finalize a plea agreement that resolved the case. Jared pleaded guilty to murdering his wife, resulting in a 40-year prison sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Institutional Division. As part of this agreement, Jared gave up his right to appeal the verdict, waived potential defenses, including insanity, and forfeited his ability to file future habeas corpus petitions. This significantly reduces his chances of appealing his sentence. Jared will not be eligible for parole until at least 2043, meaning he is set to spend decades behind bars. As District Attorney of Whitmore County explained, being eligible does not mean being guaranteed a pardon. If denied, Jared could spend even more time in prison. Angi's family was heavily consulted throughout the process to ensure their wishes were respected. They agreed to the plea deal, believing it honored Angi's memory and allowed them the closure needed to begin healing. At the sentencing, the emotional toll on Angi's family and community was evident. District Attorney Whitmore reiterated Waller County's commitment to combating domestic violence, stating that Waller County does not tolerate domestic violence and that crimes like this would not go unanswered. He emphasized that they would fight for victims and hold perpetrators accountable. He also praised the Waller County Sheriff's Office for their thorough investigation and commitment to justice. For Angi's family, the sentencing marked the end of a painful legal process, but also the beginning of the long road to healing. While nothing could bring Angi back, knowing Jared was held accountable brought a measure of justice. At the same time, they faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives while carrying the weight of their loss. This case highlighted the devastating impact of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs, such as the concerning behavior Jared exhibited before the murder, missed opportunities to intervene, such as prior police calls to their home, Jared's violent actions during a DWI arrest, and reports of possessive behavior underscored the need for greater awareness and proactive measures. In the aftermath, community groups and domestic violence advocates used Angi's story to educate others about the warning signs of abusive relationships and resources available to those at risk. Her tragic death became a catalyst for discussions about protecting vulnerable individuals and preventing similar tragedies. The case also shed light on the complex relationship between mental health and criminal accountability. While Jared's mental health was acknowledged during the trial, the court deemed him competent and held him fully responsible for his actions. This affirmed the principle that mental health challenges cannot excuse or justify acts of violence, even when they provide context for the behavior. When Jared began his sentence, Angi's family focused on honoring her memory and supporting others facing similar struggles. They collaborated with community organizations to raise awareness about domestic violence and ensured Angi's story served as both a warning and inspiration for change. While the legal system brought justice in this case, the ultimate goal should be prevention, protecting young women like Angi before they fall victim to such violence. Those who knew Angi remember her as a hopeful, ambitious young woman who loved her family deeply. Her tragic death, at just 21, represents not only a personal loss to her loved ones, but also a collective loss to the community. Angi's dreams, dedication to supporting her family, and success as a fitness coach highlight the bright future taken from her. Ultimately, she will not be remembered solely as a victim of domestic violence, but as a determined, hard-working young woman who came to America seeking a better life for herself and her family. District Attorney Whitmore emphasized that they would seek justice for victims of domestic violence and send a message to perpetrators that in their jurisdiction, they fight for their victims. Angi's case, he noted, underscores both the critical need for this fight and the devastating consequences of unchecked violence. He stated that her memory would continue to inspire efforts to prevent such tragedies and assist those in need of safety and support to escape dangerous situations. In Luton, Bedfordshire, United Kingdom, on the evening of Monday, May 23, 2016, a 34-year-old woman was brutally murdered inside her family home on Overstone Road. Sima Khan, a devoted mother of 4 young children, became the victim of a crime so savage that it shocked the entire community. She had been stabbed 68 times. The wounds were so vicious that her head and arm were nearly severed. From the outside, the Khan residence looked like an ordinary, modern family home, blending in with the other houses in the quiet, suburban street. But inside, officers encountered a scene of horrific carnage. Blood was everywhere, as if gallons had been splattered across the walls, stairs, and floor. This story centers on the Khan family, originally from Pakistan. Sima, the elder, was born in 1982, while her younger sister, Sabah, was born 7 years later, in 1989. The family also included 2 brothers. They spent their early years in the Netherlands, but when Sima turned 18, the entire family relocated to England in search of better opportunities. The Khan household was traditional, yet modern. They maintained strong Islamic values and pride in their heritage, while also adapting to Western life. Both sisters grew up fluent in Dutch and later mastered English after the move. They shared a deep bond. Sima, known for her kindness and gentle nature, often looked after Sabah like a second mother. Sabah adored her older sister, once saying they were one soul divided between 2 bodies. When the family settled in Luton's Overstone Road, they joined a large Pakistani community. Luton, about 30 miles north of London, has one of the largest Muslim populations in the UK, with nearly a third of residents identifying as Muslim. Here, Sima pursued her dream of helping others by studying nursing. She had a natural gift for caregiving and wanted to dedicate her life to supporting those in need. After completing her training, she began working as a home care nurse. Patient described her as reliable, warm, and compassionate, a woman who radiated calm. The Khan family lived in a 2-story brick townhouse, typical of many European neighborhoods. Each apartment in this townhouse had a separate street-level entry. Such homes are commonly found in most European cities. By the time Sima turned 21, her parents began searching for a suitable husband for her. In keeping with tradition, they reached out to extended relatives in Pakistan. Arranged marriages are common among Pakistani families in the UK, sometimes even used as a means to secure British residency or citizenship. Many of these unions end unhappily, with young women, accustomed to Western freedoms, finding themselves in restrictive or even abusive marriages. But Sima's case was different. No one pressured her. She trusted her parents' judgment and agreed willingly. Family meant everything to her. She wanted to marry and start her own. Her future husband was Hafiz Rahman, a man 3 years older than her and 10 years older than Saba. Hafiz had lived his entire life in Pakistan and was considered by relatives to be a respectable match for Sima. Hafiz's family hoped that moving to Britain would give him more opportunities and a better life. By marrying a British resident, Hafiz would be able to secure a British passport and become a full-fledged citizen of the United Kingdom. After the wedding in Pakistan, Hafiz and Sima returned together to the United Kingdom. The newlyweds moved into the Khan family home, following the cultural custom in many Muslim households of living as one large, close-knit family. Hafiz eventually gained citizenship and found work as a taxi driver. He held firmly to traditional values, expecting his wife to bear children, raise them, care for her husband, prepare meals, and manage the household. Sima, however, never intended to give up her career entirely. She balanced her duties as a wife with her work caring for patients. Not long after their marriage, she became pregnant with their first child, a daughter. Before she could fully recover from that pregnancy, more followed in quick succession. In the end, they had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. 3 generations of the family lived together under one roof, supporting and caring for each other. In total, 11 people shared the townhouse. Hafiz, Sima, and their 4 children, Sima's parents, her 2 brothers, and her younger sister, Sabah. On the surface, life seemed to be going well, apart from the ordinary domestic disagreements that occur in any household, especially one so large. At some point, however, Saba began to feel growing tension with her sister. The shift started after Sima's marriage to Hafiz. Once she became a wife and mother, Sima's priorities naturally changed. To Saba, it felt like her sister no longer made time for her, focusing instead on her husband and children. Over time, Saba grew weary of living in her older sister's shadow. Within this crowded household, a secret began to take shape. Known only to 2 people, Sabah had fallen in love with her sister's husband, Hafiz. Shockingly, he reciprocated, despite the 10-year age gap, despite the taboo of Sabah being his wife's younger sister, and despite the fact that they all lived together under one roof. The 2 embarked on a passionate affair. Their attraction quickly consumed them both. It started innocently enough, fleeting glances, playful teasing, the rush of a forbidden thrill. Hafiz, more experienced, recognized what lay behind the young girl's looks. In truth, he exploited her immaturity and naivety. The affair began shortly after the birth of Sima's first child. Exhausted and fully absorbed in caring for her newborn daughter, Sima didn't notice the way her younger sister was looking at her husband. At the time, the sisters still had a fairly warm relationship. Sabah even helped look after the baby, playing the role of a loving aunt, while secretly melting into the arms of her sister's husband. Whenever no one was watching, the secret relationship carried on for years. It would occasionally end, only to resume with even greater intensity as time passed. Saba became increasingly obsessed with Hafiz. They relied on WhatsApp to communicate, the only way to conceal their affair within a household filled with family members. With each passing wave of passion, The relationship grew more volatile as jealousy of her sister deepened. She was consumed with rage. Whenever she saw Hafiz giving Sima attention, she complained bitterly that he could message her day and night, yet could never find enough time to be alone with her. The affair was dangerously complicated. The tight-knit family, all living under one roof, turned the house into a pressure cooker, a volcano on the verge of erupting, and though the affair unfolded right under their noses, no one seemed to notice. Or perhaps they simply chose to look away, pretending nothing was wrong. Most likely, the relatives simply thought any possibility of an affair between Saba and Hafiz was unthinkable. Their upbringing and faith didn't even allow them to imagine such a thing. Sima herself paid no attention to the strange glances between her husband and younger sister. She was a devoted mother of 4, juggling childcare with part-time caregiving work, exhausted and overburdened. She had neither the time nor the energy to keep watch over her husband, and she certainly never suspected such a betrayal from her own sister, whom she had loved, cared for since childhood. Meanwhile, Hafiz and Saba would steal moments together whenever Sima was away. Sometimes they used the taxi Hafiz drove for work. Other times, they met in the family's marital bedroom. At that point, the children were 7, 4, 2, and 1 years old. Since Saba often stayed home to help care for them, her presence in the bedroom didn't raise suspicion. Hafiz, with the flexibility of his taxi shifts, deliberately arranged his time off to coincide with his wife's working hours. Though their affair carried on for years, Hafiz still put his wife first. This infuriated Saba. At one point, Hafiz even considered marrying Saba as a second wife. But when he consulted a local imam, he was told it was forbidden in Islam to marry 2 sisters at the same time. So Hafiz abandoned the idea and continued meeting Saba in secret. For him, she became the ultimate forbidden fruit, young, naive, and forbidden by custom from having any relationship before marriage to Hafiz. This only made the affair more intoxicating. A few months into the relationship, Saba became pregnant. Hafiz, who refused to use contraception, insisted she terminate the pregnancy to avoid scandal and keep their affair hidden. Saba went through with the abortion, but the experience left scars. It may also have been the moment Hafiz realized that continuing an affair with his wife's younger sister was unsustainable. By February 2016, after 4 years of secret meetings, Hafiz decided to end the affair and recommit to his wife and children. He began considering moving his family into their own home, away from the crowded household, but the very thought of losing him drove Saba into despair. She couldn't bear the idea that Hafiz had chosen his wife and children over her. That desperation soon twisted into something darker. Saba began obsessively searching online for ways to remove her sister from the picture. In her mind, Sima was the only obstacle between herself and Hafiz. Without Sima, Saba imagined she could step into her place, becoming his wife and raising the children as her own. Her internet searches grew more alarming. She looked up where to buy venomous snakes, studied différents poisons, researched how to hire hitmen, and even pored over an article titled 16 Steps to End Someone's Life and Not Get Caught. In March 2016, Saba reached out to a self-proclaimed sorcerer in Pakistan who claimed he could kill through black magic. Saba paid the so-called sorcerer more than $6,000 to place a deadly curse on Sima. When nothing happened, Saba grew furious. She contacts the self-proclaimed wizard again, complaining that her life is getting worse. Hafiz no longer cares about her and seems completely indifferent. She begged him to hurry and finish off her sister so that Hafiz would finally be hers. But after she sent the money for this final ritual, the sorcerer disappeared. He had been nothing more than an online scammer. Saba couldn't bear the thought of losing Hafez forever. To her, he was her soulmate, the man for whom she had broken Islamic rules, endured an abortion, and done things most women would never dare. Worse still, her parents had started pressing the issue of marriage for her. Talks had been ongoing for months, with a potential suitor already identified, but negotiations stalled because the families couldn't agree on the terms. Even so, the pressure was immense. As much as she loved Hafiz, openly defying her parents was nearly impossible. She felt trapped, beaten down by blow after blow. To make matters worse, she had to watch her sister Sima live the life everyone envied. A devoted husband, 4 beautiful children, and what looked like the perfect marriage. By contrast, Saba was unmarried, childless, and directionless. Resentment festered, and soon her envy turned into rage. She began to blame Sima for everything that had gone wrong in her life. Those emotions drowned out any last trace of reason. For Saba, it felt like her sister was stealing the very life she deserved. To her twisted mind, the only solution was to remove Sima from the picture once and for all. Meanwhile, Sima and Hafiz had found a new apartment across Luton, where they planned to move with their children. The moving date was already set, May 25th, 2016. By then, Hafiz had grown colder towards Saba, pouring more energy into repairing his marriage. In a desperate bid to win him back, Saba sent him anguished love messages. She wrote that no force on earth could change her feelings, that her heart was bleeding for him, and that she would do anything to prove her devotion. But behind these messages lurked a darker determination. If Hafiz wouldn't come back to her willingly, she would carve her own path to a happy ending. Saba decided to take matters into her own hands. On May 21st, 2016, she went to a supermarket and bought a large knife. She knew that on the evening of May 23rd, her parents, brothers, and Hafiz would all be away at a funeral at the local mosque, mourning a recently deceased relative. Sima couldn't attend because she had caregiving duties that night. Saba was left in charge of the children, a perfect setup for the plan she had been plotting. That night, once the children were asleep upstairs, the house was hers. She waited, knife ready, needing only to lure her sister home early. At 10:15 p.m., Sima left for work. Around 11, Saba sent her a text, pretending the youngest child was inconsolable and crying for her mother. 3 minutes later, Sima replied that she was on her way back. In reality, all 4 children were sound asleep. At 11:07 p.m., a neighbor's security camera caught Sima pulling into the driveway, stepping out of her car and walking toward the front door. Seconds later, the hallway light inside flicked on. 45 seconds after that, it went dark again. Within those few minutes, Sima Khan was ambushed in her own home. The moment Sima stepped through the front door and into the ground floor hallway, she had no idea that death was waiting just a few feet away. In an instant, her younger sister Saba lunged at her with the knife she had deliberately purchased the day before at the supermarket. Sima, caught completely off guard, lost those precious seconds that might have saved her life. She never expected her own sister to be the source of such danger, and the shock robbed her of the ability to defend herself. As the first blows landed, she struggled in vain, but the frenzied assault quickly overwhelmed her. Investigators would later confirm that Sima likely died within the first few minutes of the attack, screams that were quickly drowned out by the relentless violence of her assailant. Saba's rage knew no limits. She stabbed and slashed with such ferocity that by the end, Sima's body bore 68 separate wounds. The injuries were so savage that Sima's throat was cut almost completely through, leaving her close to decapitation Even after her sister collapsed, Saba continued the onslaught, tearing off parts of her clothing and striking with such brutal force that one of Sima's arms was left hanging by little more than tissue and sinew. Upstairs, the eldest daughter was jolted awake. Frightened, she came to the top of the stairs and called out, asking her aunt what was happening. Saba, in the middle of her gruesome act, snapped at the child, coldly ordering her back to bed and dismissing the horrific sounds as nothing more than her trying to catch a mouse. The little girl obeyed, unaware that her mother was being slaughtered just a few steps below. By then, Sima had lost massive amounts of blood. Several arteries in her jugular vein were severed. Her face, head, and arm were horribly mutilated. In the frenzy, Saba herself suffered a small cut, though she barely noticed. When the killing was over, she quickly moved on to the next phase of her plan, staging the crime as a robbery gone wrong. She smashed a pane of glass on the back door to make it look like an intruder had forced entry. Then she stripped off her bloodied clothing, stuffed it into a plastic bag along with the knife, Sima's phone, and some jewelry, and hid the items in her bedroom. Calmly, she showered, washing away the evidence of Sima's blood. Only after cleaning herself up did she call her parents and then dial emergency services. When her family rushed home, they were met with a nightmare. Sima lay in the hallway in a pool of blood, her life gone. The brutality of the scene shocked even the paramedics. The wounds were so severe that police initially believed the killer must have been a man. The first step for investigators was to question the only adult who had been in the house that night, Sima's younger sister, Sima Khan. She recited her version of events with a calm, almost practiced tone. She explained, that evening, everyone else had been out. Her parents, brothers, and brother-in-law Hafiz had gone to a funeral at the mosque. While Sima had gone to work, Saba had stayed behind to watch the children. She told detectives that she had put the children to bed, though the youngest had fussed a little, prompting her to message Sima and ask her to come home sooner. By the time the baby fell asleep, Saba said she saw Sima's car pull into the driveway. Relieved, she decided to take a shower. According to her story, moments later, she heard a loud noise and her sister's screams. Throwing on a robe, she rushed downstairs and found Sima lying bloodied in the hallway. That was when she insisted. She phoned her parents and then called emergency services. When officers asked about the cut on her hand, she claimed she had injured herself on shards of glass near the broken back door. She said she hadn't seen or heard any intruder on the surface. Her explanation seemed plausible. The smashed glass, the missing jewelry, and the horrific scene were consistent with a violent burglary. Yet, detectives couldn't ignore the details that didn't add up. Saba's demeanor struck them as oddly detached, almost rehearsed. Given the brutality of what had just happened, her lack of visible grief or panic raised quiet suspicions. Though investigators reminded themselves that people cope with trauma in different ways, still, one fact remained clear. This was no ordinary crime. The sheer ferocity of the attack, dozens of stab wounds, the attempt to mutilate, did not resemble a panicked burglar. It looked personal. It looked like vengeance. The entire family experienced incredible grief from losing a loved one. Hafiz was beside himself. He spoke about how their shared dream of moving into a new apartment with their 4 children had been cruelly destroyed. Both he and Sima had been counting down the days to that move, looking forward to starting a happier chapter together. Now, that future had been stolen from them forever. Relatives, friends, and even police officers pleaded with the public for any information that might help track down the killer who had ripped away the life of a devoted mother. The whole community of Luton and the surrounding areas was shaken to its core. Hafiz himself gave an emotional statement, saying their family's hearts had been torn to pieces. What he didn't know at the time was that the true motive behind Sima's murder was tied to his own secret. The autopsy results painted a horrific picture. Sima had been stabbed 68 times. Forensic experts concluded that she likely died after the first few blows, but the attacker kept plunging the knife into her body again and again. Long after death, detectives were convinced this wasn't the work of a burglar. A random intruder would never waste precious time inflicting so many wounds after the victim was already gone. This was personal. This was rage. With that in mind, detectives decided to revisit the testimony of their key witness, Sima Khan. Sima had been close to her sister, and investigators wanted to hear her version of events again. During questioning, Sima told them that Sima had a dark secret, a secret lover. She even suggested that this man might have been the one to ambush and murder Sima. But instead of deflecting suspicion, her story had the opposite effect. Detectives noticed how Sima seemed almost eager to smear her sister's reputation at a time when Sima could no longer defend herself. The claim didn't sit right. Family members, neighbors, and friends had all spoken about Sima's character. They were adamant she would never cheat on Hafiz. In fact, her life revolved around her children, her husband, and her part-time job. She barely had the time, let alone the energy, to pursue an affair. Still, investigators considered every angle. Could this have been an honor killing? The sheer brutality of the attack led some to believe the perpetrator was male. To narrow down suspects, police mapped out the movements of each family member in the days before the crime and seized electronic devices from the household. It didn't take long before damning evidence began to surface. Detectives discovered that Sima had recently purchased a knife at a local supermarket, the very same model used in the attack. A review of her Google searches and phone data revealed an even darker truth. Sima had been carrying on a secret affair with Hafiz for the past 4 years. Their text messages left no doubt. Sima had often written about her hatred and resentment toward her sister, even accusing Hafiz of marrying Sima only to secure a passport. Their relationship had become so volatile that Hafiz eventually blocked her on social media. The case was unraveling quickly. On May 31, 2016, just 8 days after Sima's murder, detectives conducted a thorough search of Sima's bedroom. What they found erased any remaining doubt. Hidden inside were the pieces of jewelry supposedly stolen during the staged robbery. Even more damning, they uncovered Sima's missing phone, the blood-stained knife, and clothing Sima had worn on the night of the murder. Still soaked in Sima's blood, Sima was arrested immediately. At first, she denied having any part in Sima's death. Though she admitted to the affair with Hafiz, she tried to claim that the relationship had ended after a failed pregnancy and that she had distanced herself from him. Still, she clung to the story of a robbery gone wrong. But the irrefutable evidence found in her room made this claim difficult to support. After several rounds of interrogation, Sima finally broke down. She confessed to killing Sima. In her statement, she painted herself as a victim, saying Hafiz had manipulated her for years, even abused her physically, and that she felt trapped in a relationship with a man 10 years older, more experienced, and impossible to resist. The trial took place in October 2017, and it was there that Sima Khan finally admitted the truth. She pleaded guilty to the murder of her own sister. Prosecutors laid out the chilling details of her motive. What began as an infatuation with Hafiz Rahman had grown into a dangerous, obsessive fixation. She could no longer stand the fact that Hafiz belonged to someone else. In her mind, Sima's life looked flawless. Married, with children, and a stable home, while she herself remained in the shadows. That resentment turned into rage. Hafiz, taking the witness stand, described himself as a victim of manipulation. He admitted that he had made the grave mistake of giving in to Saba's advances, but he claimed he had been trapped by her threats. According to him, Saba often said she would harm herself if he ever left her, bombarding him with messages filled with desperate declarations of love. Despite his testimony about wanting to end things, prosecutors highlighted the undeniable fact that Hafiz had still continued sleeping with Saba. Even in the days leading up to the murder, the defense tried to shift some of the blame onto Hafiz. Saba's lawyer argued that Hafiz had taken advantage of a vulnerable young woman, one who had little experience with men and suffered from mental health struggles. He painted Saba as lonely, unstable, and desperate, reminding the court that she had a history of self-harm. According to the defense, Hafiz had strung her along for years, feeding her false hope of a future together, only to retreat when things became too complicated. Saba himself showed no remorse. Not a tear, not a trace of remorse. She sat motionless in the defendant's box, her face expressionless, her eyes hollow. It was clear she wasn't mourning Sima's stolen life. She was mourning her own freedom. Sima Khan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. The defense immediately sought an appeal, calling the sentence excessively harsh, but the appeals commission disagreed. The punishment, they said, was just. And so, Sima Khan remains behind bars in Bedfordshire, UK, where she will spend the best years of her life reflecting on the crime that destroyed her family. After the trial, Hafiz released a statement. He said he could never have imagined such horror unfolding within his own family. He admitted his deep shame for betraying his wife and confessed that not a day passes without regret. Hafiz remembered Sima as a devoted wife, a loving mother of 4 beautiful children, a daughter who made her parents proud, and a sister whose kindness touched everyone around her. He sighed. Her death left a permanent wound in the hearts of everyone who loved her. For her parents, the pain was almost unbearable. Losing one daughter is tragedy enough, but learning that another daughter was responsible, that was a nightmare no family should ever endure. And that brings us to the end of this tragic story, a story of jealousy, betrayal, and a family torn apart forever. Binghamton, a small, peaceful city in New York State, was once so safe that many families did not need to lock their doors when they went to bed. Children rode their bikes, delivered newspapers, played in the parks. Adults lived slowly and trusted each other. In that place, crime seems a distant thing. But on the afternoon of March 26, 1984, that peace was shattered. A 12-year-old girl disappeared on a familiar street while delivering newspapers. The whole city was in a panic. Hundreds of people rushed to search for her, but to no avail. Until the police opened the door, leading to a dark basement in a seemingly innocuous house, they were faced with a gruesome sight. The girl's body lay there, wrapped in an old blanket, with traces of the crime imprinted on the walls. From that moment on, Binghamton was no longer mentioned as a peaceful city. So, who was the killer, and how could such horror hide behind the walls of an ordinary home? To find the answer, stay with us until the very end of this video. Cherry Lindsay was born on June 6, 1971, in Binghamton, New York, USA. She was one of 4 children. Her father worked in law enforcement, and her mother was a homemaker. Since childhood, she has been a creative, dynamic person and actively participates in community activities. She played the clarinet in the school orchestra, enjoyed board games and softball, and even joined the school's softball team. Despite her busy schedule, she also volunteers at the neonatal unit of a local hospital and volunteers with the American Veterans Association. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, neonatologist, or nurse, and she studied and worked hard toward those goals. At age 12, she was in 7th grade and earning good grades. In her free time, Cherry took a part-time job delivering newspapers because she wanted to help others. She planned to save her earnings to throw a party for her favorite teacher, who was expecting a baby. By early 1984, she had been delivering newspapers for about a month. Following a regular route along 2 neighboring streets near her home, residents appreciated her reliability and politeness. She always delivered on time. In the 1,980 seconds, Binghamton was considered a safe city, and many people didn't lock their doors or windows. Cherry's family lives in an area with a low crime rate. Still, her mother often accompanied her on paper routes, and her father, a police officer, encouraged people to be vigilant. On Monday, March 26, 1984, Cherry's mother stayed home to prepare a special dinner and couldn't accompany her. Cherry came home after school and left to deliver papers around 3:30 p.m., promising to return in about an hour so she could call a friend. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her mother later carried lifelong guilt for letting her go alone that day. At 4:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was a neighbor boy, a friend of Cherry's, asking to speak with her. Realizing that Cherry hadn't returned as promised, and knowing how punctual she always was, her mother grew concerned. She tried to stay calm, thinking that Cherry might have lost track of time while talking to someone, but she informed her husband. He immediately notified fellow officers to be vigilant and report anything unusual. Following his instructions, Cherry's mother began calling her daughter's friends and relatives. They checked with Cherry's aunt, to whom she was very close, but she hadn't seen her. An hour passed with no news. No one knows where Cherry is, and her parents are very worried. No one had seen Cherry since she left on her regular paper route. Her father and other officers couldn't wait any longer. They began searching the area, focusing on the 2 streets where she usually walked. They also spoke with people along the route, including Cherry's friends. Her best friend reported that they had seen each other from across the street earlier that day and exchanged a quick wave. Cherry stayed focused on her deliveries and didn't stop to chat. This sighting helped investigators narrow down the timeline of her disappearance. The last time anyone saw Cherry was around 4:00 p.m. She was alone, and witnesses noticed nothing unusual. Some people assumed she had gone to visit friends and would return soon. Her parent disagreed. She was a homebody, never went out without permission, and all her belongings were still in her room. By 7:00 p.m., her father, himself a police officer, and other officers had interviewed most residents on the 2 streets where Cherry usually delivered newspapers. They found nothing useful. That evening, the police department alerted the entire city, bringing more officers into the search. By the next morning, firefighters, county and state police, Kminusnina units, and a police helicopter joined in. The search area expanded into the outskirts, but no trace of Cherry was found. Her father was one of the most active searchers. He frequently called home, hoping Cherry had returned, and it was all a misunderstanding. Each time, his wife tearfully told him there was no news, until she remembered something important. She recalled that during her paper route, Cherry was afraid of a house 7 blocks away. A man there always stared at her in a way that gave her goosebumps. Cherry mentioned it to her mother repeatedly. Her father took this lead seriously. Police went to the house, but no one answered the door, and it seemed empty. Without cause to force entry, they had to leave. He kept the address in mind. About 30 hours of unsuccessful searching passed. With no new information, police held a press conference to draw public attention. Several tips came in, but all were dead ends. Soon after, The previously absent resident of that house appeared. Detectives went to see him. He is James Wales, 35 years old. He lives a quiet, normal life and rarely attracts attention. He remembered Cherry, who had delivered his papers, but said he hadn't seen her in days and didn't know where she was. There was no basis to arrest him, but detectives found him unsettling and took interest. With no other leads, they began to focus on him. News of the suspicious resident spread. A local journalist visited James, who let him in and answered questions about Cherry, though he seemed reluctant and quickly grew nervous. The journalist reported his concerns to police on March 27, 1984. Cherry's father ran a records check on James. He had no serious criminal history, only prior incidents of drunk driving and trespassing. The trespassing occurred years earlier when, drunk after leaving a bar, he wandered into a field a few kilometers from home. No one was harmed, and he received a warning. A deeper look revealed something more troubling. Years before Cherry went missing, James lived in Normandy, New York. The files show that the parents of a boy once filed a complaint alleging that James committed abuse. The case was transferred to social services and then closed without law enforcement action. He was never charged. These findings increased suspicion that he might be involved in Cherry's disappearance. Detectives met with him again. They noted he was unusually nervous, dodged direct questions, and avoided eye contact, especially when asked about Cherry, further heightening their concern. Despite James denying he saw Cherry on the day she disappeared, detectives brought him to the station for formal questioning. There, detectives found James uncomfortable communicating, unwilling to cooperate, and almost immediately requested a lawyer. While James was being questioned, his wife also spoke to the police. Convinced that her husband had nothing to do with Cherry's disappearance, she agreed to have her home searched. Investigators soon found a paper bag matching the one Cherry used for her newspapers and Cherry's earrings in a dresser drawer. 2 hours later, the search continued. A detective went down to the basement and discovered what looked like dried blood. In the back of the room, they found a blanket wrapped around a girl's body. It was 12 years old, Cherry Lindsay. She was dead. Meanwhile, at the station, James continued to deny any involvement. James admitted he knew Cherry. Like other neighbors, he received newspapers from her and described her as very punctual. He offered nothing else. When informed about the discovery in his home, he stopped cooperating. Detectives believed his resistance wouldn't last. About 90 minutes later, James confessed. He said Cherry had delivered the newspaper and he lured her inside. She screamed immediately. He tried to silence her by covering her mouth, but she fought back and he began strangling her. As Cherry struggled harder, he grew enraged, grabbed a table leg, and struck her head several times. She lost consciousness, but was still alive. He tied her hands behind her back, stuffed her t-shirt in her mouth, opened the basement door, and threw her down the stairs. Cherry sustained more injuries in the fall. James followed her downstairs, wrapped a clothesline around her neck, and continued strangling her for several minutes. When she showed no signs of life, he abused her without removing the rope. He claimed he had not intended to kill her and blamed the attack on uncontrollable, impulsive violence. He then returned to his routine, finished cooking dinner, and went back to the basement. About 15 minutes later, unsure if Cherry was dead, he used the rope still around her neck to make certain. He hung her from a sewer pipe for about half an hour. Afterward, he wrapped her body, clothes, and some belongings in a blanket, collected her newspapers and the money she had earned that day, showered, changed, and removed the clothes he had worn during the crime. He went to the basement several more times to check if she was dead. His calm, detached description of these actions suggested a complete lack of remorse. Ironically, 35 years old, James was the same man who had helped Cherry with her paper route. Though Cherry had found him creepy and strange and was wary of him, he had shown her the route for delivering newspapers. Investigators now suspect this was part of a plan to gain her trust and lure her to her death. To understand how he came to commit such a crime, police examined his background. They quickly learned James's life was marked by violence. His father died when he was young. His stepfather was abusive and drank heavily. His mother, also an alcoholic, joined in punishing him rather than protecting him. James started drinking in school and later used illegal substances. James was a troubled teenager who repeatedly tried to flee his abusive parents. Despite multiple reports of domestic violence, law enforcement took no action. At 17, he finally escaped from his mother and stepfather and enlisted in the United States of America Army. He served for 6 years and earned honors and awards. He returned to Norway in 1972 and married 3 times. His last wife was Sue Ellen. They had 2 children and, for a time, lived a normal life. After leaving the army, he worked at International Business Machines, but lost his job in 1983 due to long-standing alcohol and banned substance abuse. After being fired, his mental health deteriorated. His wife tried to support him, but they never sought professional help. He displayed paranoia and delusions, yet no official diagnosis was made, and he received no treatment. According to his wife and witnesses, he was a ticking time bomb, warnings that went unheeded until it was too late. Investigators later discovered that James had an unexpected accomplice. He had not forced Cherry into his house. She went there willingly. However, her family insisted that she would never have gone with such a suspicious man of her own accord. James had used his 11-year-old stepson, Brian. Knowing approximately when Cherry delivered newspapers, James watched for a moment when she was alone. When he saw her without her mother, he told Brian to help. Brian, who knew Cherry, invited her inside. During police questioning, Brian admitted that James had ordered him to do this. As soon as Cherry entered, James appeared and told Brian to leave. The boy ran to his upstairs room. He feared something terrible would happen, but stayed silent out of fear. After James confessed to the murder, police returned to the house to gather corroborating evidence in case he later recanted. Inside, they found Cherry's newspapers and the money she had collected, both stolen by James. Blood on the basement floor and wall indicated she had been beaten and thrown down the stairs. They recovered a blood-stained sewer pipe used to hang her, along with pieces of clothesline and fragments of her clothing. Evidence also showed the murder was premeditated. Before Cherry began her paper route, James did not subscribe to that newspaper. He subscribed only after she started working. Witnesses said he fixated on her, even following and observing her route. Based on this evidence, on April 6, 1984, James Wales was charged with second-degree murder, abuse, kidnapping, burglary, and abuse of a corpse. He was arrested, held in the county jail, and denied bail as a particularly dangerous offender. Unable to afford an attorney, he was assigned a public defender. The defense first sought his release on bail and requested a change of venue due to extensive local publicity that could compromise an impartial jury. Both requests were denied. The defense then filed an insanity plea. In 1984, the state governor signed a bill revising the standard for insanity defenses, shifting the burden to showing the defendant did not understand right from wrong. The attorney believed this was James's only chance to avoid a life sentence. The trial, initially set for July 30, 1984, was postponed multiple times at the defense's request. The trial finally began on October 18, 1984. The prosecutor presented detailed evidence: the rope used to strangle Cherry, a table leg with her blood, and James's confession, which he later tried to retract by claiming insanity. The evidence also included the newspapers and money he took after the murder. During the hearing, a defense psychiatrist testified that he believed James was insane, diagnosing him with intermittent explosive disorder, a relatively common condition marked by unpredictable anger and violent outbursts. At the time, about 200,000 people in the United States had been diagnosed with this disorder. According to the expert, James could not resist his impulses to do harm. The psychiatrist said that during multiple meetings with James in jail, he observed a range of disturbing symptoms. In one session, James claimed that during the murder, he believed he was attacking his mother, not Cherry. He blamed his mother for his abusive childhood, hated her, and wanted revenge. The psychiatrist concluded that James was unable to consider the consequences of his actions or control himself at the time of the crime. Two of James's ex-wives also testified. They said he had a tendency toward violence that could take disturbing forms. For example, James likes to strangle during intimacy and has a hard time stopping. The court then heard a detailed account of the murder and the horrors Cherry endured. Cherry's parents struggled to listen. The medical examiner testified that it took about 30 minutes for her to die from strangulation. Based on James's own timeline, even when he hung Cherry in the basement, she may still have been alive. Brian also testified against James. These events were deeply traumatic for 11-year-old Brian. He said he heard screams and muffled thuds. Cherry cried for help, and then it went quiet. Brian was too scared to leave the room because he knew how cruel James could be. He feared he would be attacked next. After 11 days of trial, the jury began deliberations. Notably, the jury did not see all the evidence investigators gathered. The judge excluded crime scene photos of Cherry, her torn clothing, and the marks left on her body, believing such shocking images might prevent the jury from remaining impartial. After 3 hours and 15 minutes, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The insanity defense failed. On November 12 of that year, James Wales was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years, the maximum allowed by state law. In his final statement, he said he was sorry, but it sounded unconvincing. As throughout the trial, James remained impassive and showed no emotion. When issuing the sentence, the judge, citing the brutality of the crime, urged the state never to grant James parole. However, James qualified for the first time in 2017. Cherry's parents could not accept this loss. They moved out of the family home and eventually put it up for sale. By then, the house had a grim reputation. Many believed Cherry's spirit was unsettled and that strange events occurred there. The house became known as haunted. Twice, new residents abandoned it, and neighbors reported moving objects, voix, and unexplained sounds. On July 30, 2020, the ghost house was demolished. At that moment, Cherry's mother also discarded her daughter's newspaper bag, deciding it was finally time to let her go. Cherry's father, however, believed her spirit would only be at peace once the killer died behind bars. The city council honored Cherry's memory in 1984 by naming a local park after her and installing a small memorial there. James was first granted parole on April 12, 2017. Like any American inmate, he could appear before a parole board, and he exercised that right. His hearings were met with public protests organized by Cherry's parents. James told the board he struggled with stress, had a difficult childhood due to his abusive grandfather, and believed he would never have killed Cherry if not for a mental health crisis. Despite his statements, the parole board denied his release. Cherry's parents continued to hold public demonstrations, calling for him to remain imprisoned for life. Ahead of each new hearing, they intensified their efforts to seek justice for their daughter. 3 years later, James became eligible for parole again. A supporter of Cherry and her family launched an online petition that gathered more than 9,000 signatures. In total, 409 pages of signatures and 120 pages of comments were submitted to the board. James was denied parole a second time. And again, in 2023, law enforcement maintained that he should remain behind bars for life. Another hearing was scheduled for 2025. Throughout this period, Cherry's family appealed to the public, doing everything they could to prevent his release. On February 28, 2023, Cherry's father died at age 81 after a brief battle with liver cancer. Before his death, he asked that James never be released. In 2025, James was denied parole again. The next hearing is scheduled for 2 years later. Cherry's mother and others fear that in 2027, the board may consider releasing James, in part because of the terminal illness he has suffered from for years. Although the family's leading advocate, Cherry's father, has passed away, his cause continues online and in person. Many supporters, including Cherry's mother, remain determined to ensure that James is never released from prison. Just before dawn, while the world still slept, the sound of a single engine broke the calm near the Foix Reservoir. Moments later, the night exploded into chaos. Flames devoured the vehicle, and thick smoke rose into the sky like a desperate plea for help. When firefighters arrived, they expected a routine car fire. Instead, they found a horror, a body, burned beyond recognition, locked inside the trunk. This wasn't an accident. Someone hadn't just tried to destroy a car, they'd tried to erase a person. The victim was a police officer, once sworn to protect others, now reduced to ashes by someone he trusted. Who could commit such a calculated, merciless act? As investigators retraced his final hours, a chilling story began to unfold. A tale of love turned toxic, jealousy that spiraled into rage, and a secret pact destined to destroy lives. This was no random crime. It was a personal betrayal of the deepest kind, one that would shake Spain and expose how far people will go to keep their lies hidden. Once you step into this story, you may never see love the same way again. Pedro Rodriguez was born in Barcelona into a troubled family. His relationship with his father and sister was distant, leaving him emotionally close only to his mother and his brother, Juan Antonio. After their mother's death, Juan became Pedro's most important spiritual and emotional support. From a young age, Pedro was passionate about motorcycles and sports. He was healthy, active, and strong-willed, and chose to pursue a career that suited his love of movement and discipline. In 2008, he joined the traffic division of the Guardia Urbana, the police force responsible for law enforcement within Barcelona. His brother followed a similar path, training to become a police officer as well. In Spain, the Guardia Urbana handles work in the city of Barcelona, while the national police cover other areas. In 2014, Pedro married Patricia and had a son, but the marriage did not last. Over the next few years, Patricia noticed a change in Pedro. He became cold, distant, and rumored to be having an affair. Friends told her they had seen him with another woman, who had 2 daughters. The couple's arguments became constant, and by 2016, Pedro asked for a divorce. He denied having another relationship, but soon after, he moved to another town to live with Rosa Peral. She is also an officer in the Metropolitan Police and has 2 children from a previous marriage. On May 4, 2017, Pedro's car and body were discovered burned near the Foix River Reservoir. Investigators confirmed Pedro's identity using forensic equipment, and some of his work items were found in the trunk. The speed and thoroughness of the crime made finding evidence extremely difficult. After confirming Pedro's death, investigators contacted his ex-wife Patricia. She stated that she and Pedro had separated long before, and that he was living with a co-worker from the police force. Investigators soon discovered that Pedro had been temporarily suspended from duty after assaulting a man who had ignored a traffic checkpoint, an incident captured on video. Rosa, meanwhile, was on medical leave at the time due to depression. When questioned, Rosa said the last time she saw Pedro, they argued and he left the house. She claimed he often disappeared for several days after their fights and had a volatile temper. When the police informed Rosa that Pedro was dead, her reaction was surprisingly calm. She refused to come to the police station, saying she couldn't leave her daughters alone, but agreed to go the next day. From that point onward, suspicion began to fall on her. On May 5th, Rosa gave her first official statement, suggesting that the mafia might be responsible for Pedro's death, an explanation investigators found unfounded. In a later statement, she admitted that she and Pedro had been together for about 8 months. Rosa said that 2 days before his death, they argued about Pedro's jealousy toward her ex-husband. She claimed he left afterward, but later sent her a message apologizing and professing his love. According to her, their relationship often followed this pattern of jealousy, arguments, silence, and reconciliation. For that reason, she said she wasn't immediately worried when he disappeared for 2 days. However, her story only portrayed Pedro as impulsive and possessive without helping investigators find the truth. A few days after Pedro's funeral, Rosa returned to the police station and accused her ex-husband, Ruben, of the murder. She described him as controlling and jealous, implying he might have killed Pedro out of rage. When questioned, Ruben acknowledged that their marriage had been full of arguments, but said his jealousy had been justified. Rosa, he claimed, had been unfaithful several times, first with a co-worker named Albert and later with Pedro. He claimed that he was no longer interested in her relationships and had never confronted her partner. Ruben had an alibi because he was at work at the time of the murder, a claim confirmed by his colleagues and superiors. With Ruben cleared, investigators turned their attention back to Rosa and to the other man in her life, Albert Lopez. Rosa Peral was born on March 27, 1981, in Barcelona. Her father, Francisco Paco Peral, was well known among those close to her. Her mother had recently passed away due to complications from surgery. Rosa met Ruben when they were very young. Their first daughter was born in 2010, and 2 years later, they married and had a second child. However, Rosa's personal life was far from stable. According to Ruben, Rosa began an affair with her colleague, Albert Lopez, while they both worked for the Guardia Urbana. Their relationship started in 2012, when they were assigned to patrol together. By 2013, just a year after her second daughter was born, she and Albert were secretly dating. Even after separating from Ruben and beginning a relationship with Pedro, Rosa continued to see Albert in secret. He remained her lover through 2 consecutive relationships. During their marriage, Ruben often tried to ignore Rosa's infidelities, but certain situations made this impossible, like when she attended police events with Albert, behaving as if they were a couple while still married. Eventually, Ruben had enough and decided to separate from her. Despite their long affair, Rosa and Albert never made their relationship official. She wanted commitment, but he refused. Albert didn't want children or the responsibility of being a stepfather to Rosa's daughters. Around this time, Rosa began dating Pedro. Unlike Albert, Pedro wanted a serious relationship and cared deeply for her and her children. Still, Albert couldn't let go. Although he started dating other women, his obsession with Rosa continued. He eventually reached out to her again, and they began meeting in secret, setting the stage for a tragic series of events that would later shock Spain. Albert had no idea that Rosa was now living with and engaged to Pedro. Albert believed Rosa was single, just casually seeing him. When he discovered she was actually with Pedro, he was enraged. Feeling betrayed, he distanced himself and tried to move on, posting photos on social media of vacations, parties, and nights out with other women. Despite this, he soon reached out to Rosa again, and they resumed their affair in secret. In April 2017, Albert proposed to Rosa in an unexpected and unusual way. One afternoon, while Rosa was relaxing on the terrace with her friends, Albert suddenly showed up, tossed a small box to her, and told her to guess what was inside. The box contained a ring. His approach was more spontaneous than romantic, yet it reflected his complicated emotions. Even though Rosa told her friends that she was engaged to Pedro, she still did not refuse Albert's gift. She accepted the ring, took intimate photos wearing it, and sent them to him. Later, her friends were stunned to see a photo where she wore two engagement rings, Pedro's on one hand and Albert's on the other. Rosa's friends, aware of her double life, often asked who she would ultimately choose. Her response was blunt. She preferred Pedro because he dressed better and was better in bed. Eventually, Pedro discovered romantic messages between Rosa and Albert, and their lives began to unravel. During the investigation that followed, police reviewed both Rosa's and Albert's professional records. Rosa's file showed no record of violence, but did include a troubling incident from her early career. When she was 23, her email was hacked, and her nude photos were sent to all her colleagues. More than a year later, she filed a complaint against a deputy inspector. However, the deputy inspector's lawyer argued that during that time, Rosa remained intimate with him and several other police officers, even though she was married. Albert, meanwhile, had a more serious record. In August 2014, he was allegedly involved in the death of a street vendor. That day, Rosa was patrolling with Albert and another officer when they stopped the vendor during a police check. The man became aggressive, stabbing Rosa and hitting her in the head before running off. Albert chased him, and moments later, the vendor fell down a steep slope. He was taken to a hospital, where he later died from his injuries. Albert claimed it was an accident, that the man had simply slipped, but investigators were not fully convinced. Because Albert was known for being shorter-tempered and aggressive, they suspected he might have pushed the man. However, with no solid evidence, the case was ruled an accident. Years later, during the investigation into Pedro's murder, Albert's violent past came up again. Detectives examined the phones of Rosa and Albert, checking their messages, calls, and GPS data from around the time of the crime. What they found was deeply troubling. On May 1, 2017, the location data from Pedro's, Rosa's, and Albert's phones placed all three at the same location, Rosa and Pedro's home. That same night, Rosa and Albert spoke by phone, and 4 hours later, Albert made a short call from a prepaid number before arriving at the house around 2:00 a.m. The next day, May 2, their phones again showed them in the same area, this time near the home of Rosa's ex-husband, Ruben. Investigators later found Pedro's burned car and body in that same area. The coincidence initially made Ruben a suspect, but his phone data proved he was nowhere near the scene. Confirming his alibi, a friend of Rosa's then revealed something even more disturbing. Just 2 days after Pedro's burned body was discovered, Rosa hosted a dinner at her home. The friend, her partner, and Albert all attended. Everyone acted as if nothing had happened, showing no sign of distress. Even worse, Rosa and Albert behaved affectionately, like a couple. Later, a colleague testified that Rosa had confided in him after the dinner, admitting she was afraid of Albert. Around the same time, one of Pedro's close friends, Alavier, refused to represent Rosa when she sought his help. He was already assisting Pedro's family and could not represent someone who was a suspect in the same case. As pressure grew, Rosa returned to the police station and changed her story. This time, instead of blaming Ruben, she blamed Albert Lopez, her former lover, secret partner, and alleged accomplice. The change puzzled investigators. If Rosa truly believed Albert had killed Pedro, why would she dine with him instead of going directly to the police? The only detail that supported her claim was that she had once said she feared Albert, but investigators suspected she might have used that statement to strengthen her defense. Eventually, police arrested both Rosa and Albert and searched their homes. Albert's apartment appeared normal, but his car stood out. It was unnaturally spotless and reeked of air freshener, cleaners, and gasoline. At Rosa's house, luminol tests detected faint blood traces on walls, towels, and various items. Investigators also noticed freshly painted areas, missing furniture, and a redecorated room, suggesting an attempt to hide evidence. Inside a wardrobe, they discovered Pedro's police badge, ID card, and phone. It was normal for Pedro's belongings to be in the house where he lived with her. But what caught the police's attention was that there were messages sent from this phone after the day Pedro was supposed to have died. May 2. It was clear that someone was impersonating him. Forensic evidence indicates that Pedro was killed between 3 and 6 o'clock a.m. On May 2, that morning, the GPS data from the phones of Rosa, Albert, and Pedro all placed them at Rosa and Albert's home. Later the same day, their phones were detected again near Ruben's house. The same area where Pedro's burned car was eventually discovered. 2 days later, when police went to speak with Rosa for the first time, she refused to let them in, claiming her daughters were asleep. She also showed officers a WhatsApp conversation she said was with Pedro, messages that investigators later confirmed had been sent after he was already dead. When police eventually brought Rosa and Albert in for questioning, they used an interview method designed to reveal inconsistencies. Each time one of them made a statement, officers repeated it to the other to observe their reactions. As expected, the two began blaming each other, Rosa blaming Albert and Albert blaming Rosa. It became clear that one or both of them were lying. In 2018, new testimony surfaced. A neighbor who had been secretly romantically involved with Rosa told police that on the night of May 2nd, he messaged her about hearing a chainsaw coming from her house. He admitted he hadn't reported this earlier because he didn't want to expose their affair. He also revealed that Rosa often called him over when Pedro was angry and left home, implying their meetings happened when Pedro was away. Investigators searched for the chainsaw but never found it. By February 2020, 3 years after the crime, the long-awaited trial began. It became one of Spain's most closely followed cases, full of sensational details and shocking revelations. On the stand, Rosa claimed Albert was the one who killed Pedro. She said that early on May 2nd, Albert came to her house, grabbed an axe, and attacked Pedro while she ran upstairs to protect her daughters. She portrayed herself as a victim, saying Albert was violent and had even hit her before during police duties. According to her, Albert forced her to clean the crime scene afterward, threatening her if she refused. Albert told a very different story. He claimed that when he arrived, Pedro was already dead, and Rosa asked him to help dispose of the body. He said Rosa manipulated him, wanting to frame her ex-husband, Ruben. That, he said, was why they drove to Ruben's neighborhood to burn Pedro's car. In admitting this, Albert confessed to helping cover up the crime. One of the most disturbing testimonies came from Antonia, the stepmother of Rosa's daughters. Antonia testified in court that the girls saw Rosa covered in blood, leading Pedro down the stairs that night. They described Pedro as disoriented, walking like a robot, possibly drugged. Investigators believe Pedro was sedated with medication he took for sciatica, pills missing from the house. Later, one of Rosa's former inmates testified that Rosa had privately confessed to dissolving Pedro's medication in water after a heated argument so he would calm down. Once he was incapacitated, she and Albert killed him. That night, Rosa and Albert left separately, Rosa in her car, Albert driving Pedro's. They went to the Foix Reservoir, where they set fire to Pedro's car with his body inside. Investigators concluded that Rosa and Albert's motives were twofold. They wanted to remove Pedro so they could continue their affair freely, and they hoped to frame Rosa's ex-husband, Ruben, with whom she was fighting over custody of her daughters, but their plan failed. Prosecutors sought 25 years in prison for Rosa and 24 for Albert, arguing that they had drugged Pedro before killing him. The case showed clear evidence of premeditation and cruelty. In 2021, the court delivered its verdict. Both Rosa Peral and Albert Lopez were found guilty of Pedro Rodriguez's murder and ordered to pay nearly €885,000 compensation to Pedro's family. Rosa received a 25-year sentence for aggravated murder. Due to her intimate relationship with the victim, having been jailed since 2017, she had already served about 6 years at sentencing. Albert received a 20-year sentence and had been imprisoned for the same length of time. While in prison, Albert reportedly attended rehabilitation programs and showed remorse, acknowledging his role in the crime, a factor that might grant him limited privileges. Both Rosa and Albert appealed their convictions, but Spain's Supreme Court rejected their petitions. However, Albert's confession left a small chance for Rosa's case to be reviewed in the future. Even in prison, Rosa continued to draw public attention. Reports emerged about her alleged relationships with other inmates, both male and female. There were also renewed claims about Albert's possible involvement in the death of a street vendor known as El Bonato. A fellow inmate alleged that Rosa confessed Albert had killed the man, saying Albert told her afterward that he did it for her, that no one would ever harm her again. More recently, Rosa filed a $30 million lawsuit against Netflix over the series Burning Body, which portrayed her story. She argued that the show violated her daughter's privacy and damaged her reputation as a mother. However, since her ex-husband, Ruben, has legal custody of the children, only he has the right to pursue such a lawsuit. While in prison, Rosa gave interviews for the documentary The Tapes of Rosa Peral, where she continued to assert her innocence. She denied hiding assets from the court, explaining that she had only transferred money to her father to avoid seizure, not to conceal it. Today, Rosa's daughters, now teenagers aged 15 and 13, visit her regularly with their grandfather, who remains her most loyal supporter. He continues to believe firmly in her innocence. Rosa maintains that she was framed, insisting she loved Pedro and would never have harmed him. Still, the courts, investigators, and much of the Spanish public believe otherwise. Her father's steadfast belief in her innocence remains one of the few enduring expressions of loyalty in a story marked by deceit, betrayal, and irreversible tragedy. The quiet streets of New Haven, Indiana. What began as an ordinary night between a married couple soon turned into a scene of horror. A blood-soaked staircase, a frantic call to 911, a husband barely clinging to life, his wife's calm voice telling dispatchers, "Have fell," but nothing about that night felt like an accident. The bruises, broken bones, and her unsettling calmness all suggested something more sinister beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. Friends who once saw Kevin and Allison Davis as the ideal couple began to wonder, had love turned deadly inside their home on Douglas Lane? By morning, Kevin was dead. Allison was a widow and a suspect. What followed was a tangled story of conflicting accounts, haunting evidence. And one question that still divides their Indiana community: was it a tragic fall or a deliberate murder? Kevin Davis was born on July 1, 1983, to his mother, Alta Diaz. From an early age, everyone liked him. His friends described him as kind, hard-working, and always willing to help others. At the age of 40, Kevin worked as a gardener and had a stable life in New Haven, Indiana. One day, he met Allison by chance. They fell in love, got married, and lived together in a house on Douglas Lane. They didn't have children, but adored their pit bull mix, Willow, whom they treated like family. To their friends, Kevin and Allison seemed like a happy couple with a full, active life. Jason Young, a friend of Kevin's, said he could sometimes be loud and opinionated, but it was all part of his personality. Allison worked in retail at Victoria's Secret, where she made everyone feel welcome and valued. She and Kevin often affectionately called each other babe. Everything about their life looked happy and stable. But beneath that surface, something dark was brewing. On the evening of Friday, August 11, 2023, Kevin arrived at East Haven Tavern around 9 p.m. Taking his usual seat at the bar while waiting for Allison to finish work. When she arrived, they greeted each other warmly. Their friend, Jason, was also there, and the three of them enjoyed drinks and laughed all night long. Kevin had a few beers and vodka shots, while Allison sipped her usual sweet cocktail. Bartenders said the night seemed completely ordinary. Around 1 o'clock emission, on August 12, Allison left first, with Kevin following soon after. They both headed home to Douglas Lane, ready to call it a night, but within hours, everything changed. At 1:11 a.m., Kevin texted Jason after getting home. Jason asked if they made it back safely. Kevin apologized and said everything was fine. He was just listening to music. They kept chatting for over an hour, with Kevin sounding cheerful and joking around. Finally, at 2:31 a.m., Kevin sent one last text, saying he was going to put his phone on silent because he needed to go to sleep. Between 2:31 a.m. and 4:38 a.m., something terrifying happened inside Kevin and Allison's home. At 4:38 a.m., Allison called 911. The call lasted about a minute. In a calm tone, she told the dispatcher that her husband had just fallen down the stairs, that there was blood everywhere, and that she couldn't flip him over. She added that she didn't know whether he was alive or dead. Detective James Kruger later said the call sounded rehearsed. Allison never asked dispatchers to hurry, and he believed her tone was more focused on herself than on Kevin. Officers Garrett Shanebrook and Corporal Cade Hetrick arrived within minutes. Allison met them outside and led them in. At the bottom of the staircase, they found Kevin lying face down in a large pool of blood. Blood covered the walls, railing, and floor. With spatter reaching high above the stairs, Kevin was barely breathing, with blood flowing from his nose and mouth. His body temperature was 91 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously low compared to the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal Cade Hetrick, who witnessed the scene, commented that this didn't look like a fall to him. There were no signs in the house that suggested a hard fall. No damaged railings, broken furniture, or dents in the walls. Kevin's body was lying flat, not twisted or wedged, as one might expect from a fall. The amount of blood made Hetrick ask Allison if there were any firearms in the house, fearing Kevin might have shot himself Allison confirmed there were firearms, but none were found near Kevin's body. Paramedics rushed Kevin to Parkview Regional Medical Center, but Allison's behavior immediately struck them as unusual. While talking to paramedics, she was laughing. She didn't seem worried about her husband's injuries. No tears. No attempt to ride in the ambulance. Detective Kruger was present at the scene and began the interrogation. Allison said that around 1:00 a.m., after returning from the bar, she and Kevin got into an argument. Kevin went upstairs to sleep, and she lay on the living room sofa. She said she woke up to a loud noise and found Kevin lying at the bottom of the stairs, thinking he was just drunk and had fallen. Allison agreed to let Kruger search the house and signed a permit. However, she warned him not to enter a room upstairs because of a guard dog named Willow. She said she did not want to go near that room. Kruger agreed not to enter the room where Willow was staying. When he opened the door slightly, Willow growled and bared her teeth. The dog wouldn't let him in. Other than that, the house appeared normal, and Kruger believed Allison's story that Kevin's fall had been a tragic accident caused by intoxication. The crime scene was cleared the same day. Allison's father, Steve Krauser, came over to clean up the blood, wanting to help his daughter in her grief. Meanwhile, Kevin's condition at the hospital worsened. His mother, Alta Beers, had received a text from Allison early that morning saying, "There's been an accident." Alta texted back for details, but got no response and went back to sleep. Assuming it wasn't serious, around 6:30 a.m., Alta finally spoke to Allison by phone and was surprised by how calm she sounded. Allison's tone made Alta believe that everything was fine, but it wasn't. Kevin's friends, Jason and Todd Spessert, hurried to the hospital. They spoke with Allison and her parents. Jason thought Allison had been crying, but was trying to hold herself together. Todd said she looked distraught. Inside Kevin's room, Allison stood by his bedside, calling to him as her father watched helplessly. Kevin suffered his third cardiac arrest that evening. At 10:07 p.m. on August 12, 2023, doctors removed him from life support. 40-year-old Kevin Davis was gone. Allison, 33, was now a widow. Friends were heartbroken. Everyone believed it had to be an accident, a terrible fall. But 3 days later, everything changed. On August 15, 2023, Dr. Scott Wagner performed Kevin's autopsy and discovered devastating injuries. The right side of Kevin's skull was crushed, with several fractures. The injuries were confined to his head. No other trauma was found. Dr. Wagner determined the damage was consistent with a fall from at least 20 feet or a high-speed car crash. The injuries would have rendered Kevin unconscious within seconds and brain dead upon impact. He concluded that Kevin's wounds could not have been caused by a fall down a normal staircase. The evidence suggested Kevin had been struck in the head with a blunt object. The Allen County Coroner's Office ruled Kevin's death a homicide on October 17, 2023, caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Detective Kruger sat in his office, processing the information. If Kevin was murdered, it meant someone else did it, and the only person with him that night was Allison. Kruger reviewed the text messages between Kevin and Allison. When he read Kevin's last text message to his wife, he felt that there was something unusual about the content, not at all gentle. Kruger sensed tension between them. Then he discovered something even more troubling. Allison had given conflicting accounts of what happened that night. To police, Allison claimed she and Kevin had been drinking and argued after returning home. She said she slept on the couch while Kevin went upstairs. To Kevin's mother, Alta, Allison claimed Kevin had not been drinking and that they had been in bed upstairs when Kevin got up for water and accidentally fell down the stairs. To Kevin's brother, Allison said that she was in bed with her dog, Willow, and heard Kevin moving around but didn't pay attention because Willow was still lying there. She only went to check on Kevin later and found him fallen. And to the medics, Allison said she hadn't heard anything and hadn't seen Kevin for some time before finding his body. The stories contradicted one another, and Kruger believed Allison had been caught lying. Doctors also found something alarming. Kevin's body temperature was so low upon arrival at the hospital that he was hypothermic, and his brain had almost no oxygen. One doctor said she had seen drowning victims with higher oxygen levels than Kevin. This suggested Kevin may have been brain dead for hours before Allison called 911. 4 weeks after Kevin's death, Kruger met with his mother, Alta. She told him that Kevin and Allison were having marital problems and were possibly about to separate. This reinforced Kruger's suspicions. He believed that Allison had lost control and beaten her husband to death, possibly with a blunt object such as a kettlebell, dumbbell, or baseball bat, and then staged the crime by dragging his body down the stairs. However, no weapon was ever recovered. Kruger theorized that it might have been hidden in the upstairs bedroom with Willow, a room he hadn't searched. The thought haunted him. Kruger admitted that he completely regretted not having searched that room on the morning of the 12th, and that the murder weapon could have been there on December 22, 2023. A warrant was issued for Allison's arrest. 3 days before Christmas, she arrived at the Allen County Jail with her parents and told the officers that she was Allison Davis and that she was there to turn herself in. She was handcuffed in front of them. Allison was charged with murder and held without bond. For the next 17 months, she remained in jail, able to see her family only during attorney visits through plexiglass. There were no video calls or regular visits, only waiting. From her cell, Allison told loved ones she couldn't sleep because she kept reliving that morning. She said she missed Kevin deeply and longed to hear him call her babe again. The prosecution believed their case was solid, but the defense saw things differently. On May 6, 2025, Allison Davis went on trial for murder. Chief Deputy Prosecutor Tissa Helge presented Dr. Bill Smoke as her key witness. Dr. Smoke, known for testifying in high-profile cases, including those of Derek Chauvin and Robert Feldman, was described as a police surgeon showing the jury CT scans of Kevin's skull. Dr. Smoke testified that Kevin had suffered multiple blows to various areas of his head. He concluded that Kevin had been beaten to death, not fallen down the stairs, and that a blunt object, possibly a kettlebell, weight, or baseball bat, had likely been used. The prosecution focused on Allison's calm tone during the 911 call, her inconsistent statements, and her behavior with paramedics. They argued that Kevin's body placement at the base of the stairs did not match a natural fall. Crime scene technician Timothy Garrett testified that the blood found in the hallway and living room could not have come from a stair fall, stating that blood cannot turn a corner. Dr. Smock testified that Kevin's low body temperature showed he had been lying there for at least 2 hours before the 911 call. The prosecution claimed Allison had delayed the call to create her story and hide the weapon. The defense, led by attorneys Andrew Baldwin and Max Wiley, countered that there was no murder weapon, physical evidence, or motive. They argued Kevin had been legally intoxicated and fell down the steep stairs, hitting his head on the banister post. For support, they brought in Dr. Visa Dragovic, a forensic neuropathologist specializing in brain injuries. Dr. Dragovic testified that Kevin suffered only one head impact when he hit the banister post. That single, powerful blow shattered his skull in multiple places, causing his brain to bounce inside his head as bone fragments acted like shrapnel. He also disputed the prosecution's interpretation of Kevin's low body temperature. According to Dr. Dragon, The impact destroyed Kevin's hypothalamus, the part of the brain that regulates temperature, causing his body to cool abnormally. The low temperature, he said, was evidence of severe brain damage, not a delayed emergency call. He explained that the absence of blood on the banister was due to Kevin's internal injuries. The bleeding occurred inside his head and exited only through his nose and mouth. Baldwin criticized the police investigation, pointing out that the crime scene was released the same day. Photos were taken 4 days later, and Allison's father was allowed to clean up blood. Friends described Kevin and Allison's marriage as happy. Jason said Kevin's joking text about his wife was just a joke. Wiley argued that Allison was not the kind of woman who would violently attack her husband. The jury never saw data from Allison's Garmin smartwatch, which the defense claimed supported her version of events. Judge Fran Gull ruled the data inadmissible after 6.5 hours of deliberation on May 9, 2025, around 11:00 p.m. The jury returned a verdict, not guilty. Allison Davis was acquitted of murder. Her father, Steve, watched as she broke down in tears of relief, though she remained in jail briefly for release processing at 2:12 a.m. On May 10, Allison walked out of jail to Cheers after spending 17 months behind bars. Her first meal as a free woman was wings and pizza. An anonymous juror said the reason they acquitted was because the prosecution had no convincing evidence, no weapon, no hard evidence, no way to determine how the crime happened. Dr. Dragovich's testimony helped them better understand Kevin's trauma. Without solid evidence, they couldn't convict Detective Kruger. Now the police chief was devastated. He said that he was 100% convinced Allison had murdered Kevin, adding that his biggest regret was not having searched the bedroom shared with Willow, where he believed the weapon might have been hidden. Kevin's mother, Alta Beers, showed grace, despite her grief. Alta took comfort knowing Kevin's organ donations saved 4 lives. Allison returned to her parents' home with Willow, choosing a quiet life as she tried to rebuild after losing her husband and spending 17 months in jail for a crime. The jury said she didn't commit. Kevin's death remains officially classified as a homicide. The case is still unsolved, and no one has been held accountable. Westerville, Ohio, a peaceful city where the streets are tree-lined. In that small community, Emily Noble is known as a small but strong woman, a soul who loves nature, loves silence, and has always overcome all the losses in her life. Those around her see in Emily a rare resilience, a person who has lost friends, lost parent, lost a husband, but never lost faith in life. But in May 2020, Emily's life took a turn no one could have imagined. She disappeared the morning after her 52nd birthday. Her car, phone, and wallet were all still at home. 4 months later, her body was discovered hanging from a tree. Emily Noble, age 52, lived in Westerville, a peaceful suburb near Columbus, Ohio. She had worked for the state of Ohio's Medicaid office for over 10 years. As the main income provider, she had around $96,000 in personal savings. However, Emily's identity was not defined by her financial status. Emily was only 5 feet tall and weighed under 100 pounds. She had osteopenia, a condition that made her bones more fragile than average. Friends described her as lively, free-spirited, brave, and always smiling. She shared a special bond with her sister, Amy. Emily loved nature and often foraged for edible plants in the woods near her home. Every morning, she posted sunrise photos on Facebook. She was known for taking long, peaceful walks through her neighborhood. She treasured quiet moments, and the space to think, but Emily's life had been marked by loss. In the 1,990 seconds, she witnessed several close friends die from AIDS. Her father suffered a catastrophic accident. He slipped, fell, hit his head, and never recovered. Less than a year later, her mother died in a car crash. She inherited her mother's condo on Abbey Cross Lane in Westerville, an 800-square-foot home that became her refuge. In 1983, Emily broke her nose in a fall, an injury that would become forensically relevant decades later, and in 2011, her first husband died by end his life. Emily had a history of depression. She sought therapy throughout her life, but her friends all said the same thing. She always pushed through. She always found her way back. After her first husband's death, Emily joined a dating site called Plenty of Fish, where she met Matthew Moore. At the time, he was living in Las Vegas and working in the casino industry. They married in 2018, and Moore moved to Ohio with his teenage son, Joey. From a previous marriage, Moore's past was complicated. His ex-wife, Lisa Peterson, later testified about an incident on New Year's Day, 2001, just 3 months into their marriage. She said Moore choked her while she was pregnant. They argued, and he suddenly put his hands around her neck. She said it was the only time he ever physically harmed her. They divorced in 2006. They had 2 children together. One of them died young. Though the cause was never publicly disclosed, Moore's mother died in 2018, and he placed his inheritance into a joint account with Emily. Their combined balance exceeded $400,000. Then, in the summer of 2019, tragedy struck yet again. Moore's 17-year-old son, Joey, died by end his life by hanging in a park not far from their home. It devastated Moore. Moore's therapy notes expressed deep concern for his mental health after Joey's death, but there were no allegations of violence. By May 2020, the global health issues had changed their lives. Moore was unemployed. Emily continued working, still carrying the financial weight of the household. There were tensions in the marriage. Text messages revealed arguments about Moore's drinking, his mood, and name-calling. One message stood out. Emily said she was afraid to go home. Yet Moore also sent messages encouraging her, urging her to stay hopeful. When he asked whether she wanted a divorce, she never said she did. Friends noticed troubling signs. Suzanne Kavanaugh saw bruises on Emily's arm. The last time they met, she raised concerns about the relationship, which ultimately strained their friendship. Emily had also stopped wearing her wedding ring before she disappeared. Yet, despite all these signs, Emily seemed to be improving. She was transitioning back to full-time work. She was, as always, finding her way through. May 24, 2020, was Emily's 52nd birthday. That morning, she and Moore drove to Buckeye Lake to collect water from a natural spring. They returned to Westerville, stopped by the Field of Heroes Memorial, and had a small picnic in the park. The global health issues restrictions had just eased, and bars were reopening. To celebrate, they decided to go bar hopping in downtown Westerville. Their first stop was the Cobalt Grill restaurant, where they took selfies together. Bartender Jessica served them around 7 o'clock p.m. They were her only customers. They stayed for roughly 45 minutes and told her they were continuing their birthday outing. They left around 7:30 p.m. Their neighbor, John, later said he saw Emily at home sometime around 8 o'clock p.m. According to Moore's account, they returned home, went to bed, and he slept in the guest room so he wouldn't disturb her. User activity on Emily's phone stopped after 6 o'clock p.m. On May 24, Moore, meanwhile, had a 30-minute phone call with a friend just after 7:30 p.m. His phone showed uninterrupted user activity until 6 a.m. The next morning, May 25, 2020, Moore claimed he slept until about 10 a.m. When he woke up, Emily was gone. Left behind were her car in the driveway, her keys, her phone, her wallet, her credit cards, everything. At 2:47 p.m., Moore used Emily's phone to call her friend, asking if she had seen her. Shortly afterward, he filed a missing person report with the Westerville Police Department. Officer Robert Hollis responded, and his body camera footage captured the entire interaction. Both cars were there. Nothing immediately suggested foul play, but Detective Steve Grubbs later admitted that his instincts were triggered. Something about Moore's version of events felt wrong. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers gathered at Westerville North High School to help search. Multiple agencies joined in. The FBI, state police, Caminos Nina units, dive teams, bloodhounds, and cadaver dogs searched the condo area, the neighborhood, and the western woodline. Dogs tracked along the road near the condo and the bike path, but there was a crucial mistake. The area where Emily's body would eventually be found was never searched. Police Chief Charles Chandler later told the media that the area had been searched 3 times. This was not true. Moore's behavior during the search struck many as unusual. He claimed he had shown flyers at 2 Black Lives Matter rallies, yet Emily's family said he refused to join any organized search efforts. Eventually, he stopped cooperating with police altogether. Then, in September 2020, Moore contacted producers of the Vanished podcast, pleading for Emily's case to be featured. The episode aired that month. Both producers and listeners found Moore's interview extremely odd. When asked to describe Emily, Moore said he never saw her weigh herself, that she was tiny, like 100. He described her legs, her arms, her posture, and said she was, anatomically, a really pretty lady. He made strange comments about her facial expressions. Podcast researcher Amanda Coleman later said Moore said things to her that she had never heard in any interview before. The interview raised red flags. On Wednesday, September 16, 2020, 3 local women were foraging in a wooded area west of Emily and Moore's condo, just off County Line Road. Less than half a mile from the home, it was a place Emily frequently visited to forage for edible plants. That's when they saw it. Skeletal remains, suspended from the branch of a honeysuckle tree. A 20-inch black plastic USB cord was wrapped around the neck and tied to the branch above. When the remains arrived at the Montgomery County Coroner's Office at 2:08 a.m. on September 17, they weighed only 18 pounds. X-rays and photographs were taken. The remains were described as skeletonized with only minimal mummified tissue. On September 22, dental records confirmed the body was Emily Noble. Police Chief Chandler called the case highly unusual. A black water bottle lay beside Emily's left leg, filled with a peach-colored liquid containing 6% alcohol. Her engagement ring and wedding band were also placed next to her left leg. She had removed them. Her right hand was gripping her right ankle. Her left arm rested downward. With her hand touching the water bottle, she was dressed in black Old Navy leggings, a black spaghetti-strap tank top, a white Old Navy long-sleeved shirt that had slipped down around her waist, and trainers. An e-cigarette was tucked into the pocket of her leggings. The USB cord and other items recovered at the scene tested negative for DNA. On October 2, 2020, the remains were transported to Ohio State University. Dr. Amanda Agnew and a graduate student in the OSU Skeletal Biology Research Lab conducted additional analysis. Their report, completed on January 11, 2021, identified 4 fractures in the hyoid bone, fractures in the nasal cavity, and several missing toe bones. A portion of the hyoid bone was also absent. The injuries were determined to be perimortem, occurring at or near the time of death, or post-mortem. 10 days later, the Montgomery County coroner ruled the cause of death as multiple injuries to the face and neck, but the case didn't take its decisive turn until May 27, 2021. Dr. Bill Smock issued his findings. Dr. Smock, a forensic physician and strangulation expert, produced the report that became the centerpiece of the prosecution's theory. He concluded that Emily had been manually strangled. The 4 fractures in her throat, he said, combined with facial fractures caused by blunt force trauma, indicated her death had been staged to resemble a hanging. In his opinion, the evidence was consistent with homicide. However, Dr. Smock was not a board-certified forensic pathologist. He was an emergency medicine doctor who had completed a 1-year clinical forensic medicine fellowship in 1994. More critically, Dr. Smock never examined Emily Noble's remains in person. He never visited the scene. His conclusions were based solely on reports and photographs. On September 16, 2021, exactly 1 year after the remains were found, a death certificate was issued. The manner of death: homicide by manual strangulation. Delaware County Coroner Dr. Mark Sleeper, a family practice physician rather than a licensed forensic pathologist, later explained the delay. OSU specialists had initially refused to endorse the homicide ruling. Sleeper eventually learned that, as the elected coroner, he could sign the certificate himself. Meanwhile, in March 2021, investigators returned to the area where the body had been found. They discovered bones that had been missed during the initial recovery, including Emily's arms. Bones investigators originally believed had been taken for DNA testing but were, in fact, still lying in the soil. The discovery exposed serious flaws in the initial scene processing. The case against Matthew Moore remained largely circumstantial, but prosecutors believed it was powerful. Phone records created a troubling timeline. Emily's phone stopped showing user activity at 6:00 p.m. On May 24, Moore's phone, however, showed continuous activity until 6:00 a.m. The next morning, analysis of Moore's phone revealed something critical. While he claimed he had been at a bus depot that morning, part of his job checking advertisements on buses, the data told a different story. At 9:25 am, Moore's phone pinged off a tower at Murphy's Quarry. Less than a mile from the home, the quarry was visible from the property. CCTV footage captured what appeared to be Moore's blue Fiat driving past the quarry at 9:59 a.m. Heading away from the house, only after this did his phone appear in Broadstone, where he claimed to have been the entire morning. CCTV cameras filmed Emily passing the quarry 3 minutes later. She was seen returning home at 9:41 a.m. Investigators believed she was killed shortly after she arrived back at the condo. Police also learned that Moore had moved items in the garage while officers were present during the missing person investigation. He shifted an orange extension cord and a cooler, leaving a flashlight next to both objects. Prosecutors argued that he used the flashlight to illuminate the woods while staging Emily's body at night. Moore's behavior during his police interview raised additional concerns. He repeatedly referred to Emily in the past tense. He mentioned end her life multiple times. Long before her body had been found, on June 17, 2021, more than a year after Emily vanished, a Delaware County grand jury returned an indictment. Matthew Moore was arrested the same day during a traffic stop by heavily armed Westerville police officers. Reporters surrounded him as he stood in handcuffs. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, felony murder, and purposeful murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. Bond was set at $5 million. Moore remained in the Delaware County Jail until the trial concluded. The trial began on August 16, 2022. Prosecutors Mark Sleeper and Melissa Schiff faced off against defense attorney Diane Menashe. The jury visited the couple's home and the wooded area where Emily's body had been discovered. Opening statements were delivered on August 17. The prosecution framed its case around Emily's resilience. Lead prosecutor Sleeper recounted the tragedies Emily had endured, the friends she lost to AIDS, the deaths of her parents, her first husband's end his life. The prosecution's star witness was Dr. Bill Smock. He testified without hesitation. Emily Noble's hyoid fracture did not come from her hanging, it came from strangulation. She was strangled manually and then placed in the tree. During Dr. Amanda Agnew's presentation on the skeletal analysis, she was questioned about her findings. She admitted that the right nasal cavity was not fractured and that a graduate student contributed to the report. The defense attacked the integrity of the investigation itself. Crime scene evidence had been mishandled. Teeth and bones had been left behind, only to be recovered months later. The wooded area where Emily's body was ultimately found had never been searched. No DNA, no blood, no direct link tying Moore to the crime. During closing arguments, the prosecution revealed their full theory for the first time. They believed Moore had followed Emily during a walk on the evening of May 24, attacked her in the wooded area after his 30-minute phone call around 7:30 p.m., and then staged the scene during the 3-hour. Moore grew visibly emotional in the courtroom, throwing up his arms in frustration. When Menashe referenced Moore's son's end his life, Moore wiped away tears. At least one juror was seen crying. On August 26, 2022, after just under 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty on all 3 counts. Moore collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands as he sobbed. He cradled his head and repeatedly mouthed, "Thank you," toward the jury box. In March 2023, Moore published a book titled Emily, a staged suicide in Ohio. In it, he maintains that Emily died by ended her own life. He described the writing process as therapeutic and said he hoped Emily's family would one day read it. Despite her family's unwavering belief that Emily Noble was murdered, and despite her death certificate listing homicide by manual strangulation, no one has ever been convicted. The truth of what happened in those woods remains unresolved, suspended between 2 stark possibilities. What is certain is that Emily, a 52-year-old woman who spent her life overcoming tragedy, is gone.